Chapter 279. The deeper Seiji ventured into the palace, the more he was amazed by the structure that defied common sense. It was impossible for this place to exist in a three-dimensional space. It was just like a toy box that had been messed up. Even though every corner of the palace appeared solemn and majestic, there was nothing that made sense about it. Sometimes, when he turned a corner, he would see countless dilapidated palaces. When he pushed open a small wooden door and walked through a wooden door, he would find himself in a solemn hall with countless flesh and blood wriggling around like worms. After passing through a corridor, the fake scenery would transform into a literal hell. When he took a step back, the world would change again. If it weren't for the crow's guidance, he might have already been lost in this maddening maze. Not only was this palace chaotic and disorderly, but it also faintly contained a power that made one go crazy. Huaisher guessed that if one was infected by the outside world, the more they overestimated themselves and walked forward, the more horrifying and tragic the situation they saw would be. In the end, they would be completely imprisoned in the deepest part of hell. But when he passed through a long corridor and pushed open a paper door, he found himself in front of a silent shrine. The crisp sound of a bell rang in the distance. Seiji couldn't hear it clearly because of the towering torii, but the crisp bell had a strange magical power that dazzled and mesmerized him. He couldn't help but be drawn in by it. In just a short moment of waiting, Huaisher saw several dazed attendants stagger into the torii and follow the crisp bell into the darkness. It didn't take long for them to reach the bottom and turn into shriveled corpses in the darkness. In the courtyard behind the torii, the bell's ringing became louder and clearer. It absorbed the prey in the trap and condensed them into something solid. The Kagami bell. This was a ritual that belonged to the local religion of Ingzhou. It slowly vibrated in the darkness and made a rhythmic low sound. As the bell's ringing overlapped, a faint and distant song and melody sounded from the courtyard in the deepest part of the darkness. A flickering flame lit up, but in this deathly silent shrine, it didn't bring any warmth. Instead, it made this place even colder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He could not tell whether it was a chant or a song, but a child's whisper suddenly sounded in his ears, as if it wanted to drill into his soul. The child softly chanted an ancient incantation that was difficult to understand. Biliu tribe, from good to good, Biliu tribe. The crisp sound of white jade colliding with each other gradually evolved from this lingering chant, constantly reverberating in his mind. When he suddenly woke up from his stupor, he realized that he had unknowingly uttered the inexplicable words in his mind and stepped in a torii. He felt his face stiffen. At first, he thought that it was his face that was frozen, but when he touched it, he felt a cold, smooth texture of iron. It wasn't until he staggered back and stepped out of the torii that his petrified skin returned to normal under the nourishment of vitality. Then, he saw. With the singing of the sacrificial song, all the plants of the shrine courtyard were quickly petrified. In the end, they were like clusters of beautiful jade, fixed in an enchanting and gorgeous posture. Wisps of black mist rose from it, full of greed and ferocity. Even if it was only a drop, it was a fierce poison that was enough to destroy Huaisher's soul. He couldn't go in. The premonition of death beat his consciousness like never before, bringing him such a resolute judgment. He would die if he went in. He should have turned around and left, but the mountain ghost's holy mark seemed to be cheering, as if it had sensed something hidden in the shrine and started a pulsating resonance. Huaisher could conclude that there was something inside, something he had to get. If he missed this opportunity, he would lose it forever. He didn't know when such a thought had appeared in his mind, but it caused him to be at a loss and unable to make a choice. This place was truly too dangerous for him. Even a single glance from a single snake-faced attendant had caused the withered marks on his arm to not vanish until now. Should I do it or not? That's the question. Huaisher scratched his head, hoping that someone would come over and say a few words to encourage him and give him courage. But just when he needed it the most, Crow had disappeared. He had no idea where Crow had run off to. He had to face this problem by himself. There was still a bit of time left. Huaishur patted his pockets and squatted outside the Torii shrine like an old farmer, observing the eerie shrine. He thought about it, calmly analyzed it, boldly hypothesized, carefully verified it, seriously considered it, and seriously considered it. Finally, he put out his cigarette. He turned around and left. I'm leaving. There are too many perverts in this group. I only have one life. I shouldn't waste it like this. But after taking 2 steps back, he felt reluctant to leave. He looked back at the pitch-black shrine and recalled Crow's words. The opportunity to transform a bicycle into a motorcycle and a motorcycle into a tomahawk is right in front of me. I'm already here. It's New Year, and I'm still young. Is it really appropriate to leave like this? Huaishur let out a long sigh, gritted his teeth, and stomped his foot. He had decided to do this job. He threw away his final hesitation and carefully took out the crumpled flyer from his pocket. He looked at the picture of a kitten on it. Let's draw a circle first. A cold wind blew through the air. Then, he drew a smaller circle next to the larger one. A tragic screech sounded out as countless amounts of origin substance gathered in the 2 circles, revealing layers of malice from the abyss. Huaishur hesitated for a moment, then used his withered finger to draw a final circle. Instantly, a thunderous sound tore through the silence inside and outside the shrine. Even the eerie chanting was interrupted. The ground shook violently. Huaishur's movements were swift as he filled in the missing facial features. Soon, a lifelike kitten picture appeared in front of Huaishur. Immediately afterwards, it began to madly absorb his origin substance. It wasn't until more than half of his origin substance was sucked dry that darkness erupted from the picture like a volcano in the paradise. The kitten woke up from his stupor and felt a call from afar. After hesitating for a moment, he turned around and looked at the silent paradise behind him. The lights in the paradise lit up one by one, and the silent castle's doors opened with a bang. In the darkness, doors opened one after another. In the end, a group of pitch-black figures slowly emerged from within. The silhouettes, covered in darkness, made it difficult to see their faces. Only a pair of scarlet eyes lit up in the darkness, bursting with fury and greed. The kitten was stunned. Hey, you're actually this good to it. He was a little unconvinced as he stomped his feet. He put his hands on his hips and stared at the paradise in front of him with wide eyes. You don't know how expensive the daily necessities are until you're in charge. Just go and show your sincerity. Do you need the legal department to come out in full force? A sharp whistle sounded from the depths of the paradise, as if it was a response from the darkness. After a long time, the kitten sighed and shook his head helplessly. Fine, do as you wish. He waved his hand helplessly. Fortunately, this is the last ticket. Otherwise, sooner or later, everyone will be offended by you. Hey, remember to bring back some specialties. Don't come here in vain. So, after a long wait that made Huaishur feel a little incredulous, an ancient wooden door slowly rose in the darkness. It was decorated with patterns and reliefs from hell. Just looking at it, a mournful and painful aura hit him in the face. Huaishur swallowed his saliva and took a step back subconsciously. Then, he heard the sound of knocking behind the door. It was as if fate was knocking on the door. Huaishur summoned up his courage, reached out his hand, and slowly twisted the door open. Then, a hurricane gushed out from the darkness behind the door, followed by a pair of pitch-black eyes that emerged from the open gap, staring at Huaishur, who was close at hand. However, being stared at by that pair of eyes, Huaishur couldn't move. Only a small shadow of a crown appeared on the top of his head, proving his identity. After a long time, as if finally acknowledging him, the shadow slowly nodded and said with a hoarse voice, "We're the pirates?" Huaishur breathed a sigh of relief. He was sweating profusely and almost couldn't stand still. His whole body leaned on the open door. Hearing the shadow's question, he hurriedly turned around and looked behind him. A finger popped out and pointed straight at the darkness behind the torii. The shadow didn't talk much. The shadow just nodded, took a step forward, and walked out of the dark door. The earth rumbled, and cracks spread in all directions. A crack appeared on the torii, as if it couldn't bear the arrival of the strong. Holding something that looked like a briefcase in his hand, the shadow took out a pair of gold-rimmed glasses and put them on his face. He took out a document with the theme park seal from the briefcase and stuck it on the door of the torii. For some reason, it glanced back at Huaishur with a meaningful look. Then, he waved his hand behind him. As he moved forward, a line of pitch-black figures rushed out from behind the Hell's Gate and followed him into the shrine. The legal department was on the move. The melody of the song was instantly torn apart, and the chanting disappeared without a trace. The entire shrine seemed to be shaken by the shadow's power. Countless ropes shook angrily, and the petrified flowers and plants in the courtyard were all shattered. Countless vicious, vengeful spirits flew out and pounced on the shadow from the legal department. The shadow sneered and raised his hand. The vengeful spirits that pounced on him froze in place and collapsed with a scream. The terrifying monsters from the theme park walked into the shrine. They were like tanks, rampaging through everything. Wherever it passed, everything was crushed into powder by that terrifying power. The torii outside the shrine collapsed. The jindo behind the torii collapsed. The venom-filled torii house collapsed. The bibliotheca library with notices on it was reduced to ashes. On both sides of the shrine, the blood-colored foxes on the stone pedestals opened their eyes. They quickly expanded and pounced, but they were trampled into pieces by the shadow from the legal department. The good brothers of darkness charged forward with a violent aura that caused all the gods and Buddhas to retreat. They chopped everything in their path and went straight for the root of the problem. They smashed the gift box in front of them with one punch, then raised their fist and tore the walls of the shrine. The darkness on their bodies rose up, and they grabbed the bloodthirsty, sword shadows that flew up from the shrine and crushed them with all their might. In the shrine, surrounded by the jade fence, there was suddenly a bitter and shrill scream. Huaishur, who was hiding in the dark, was stunned. The army of this theme park is too ferocious. But he recalled the meaningful look that the shadow gave him just now. Huaishur suddenly turned around and saw that the lawyer's letter that was stuck on the broken torii had spontaneously combusted without any wind. More than half of it was burned. There was not much time left. Chapter 280. Under the crack in the sky, they could see the fire of the stars descending from the sky. The earth was shaking. The darkness behind them was converging like a tsunami, forming an iron wall that was tens of thousands of feet high. It was shrinking inch by inch, and its speed was getting faster and faster. Only 400 people left. Big Bone was curled up in the shadow of the tall building. He looked at the rapidly falling number on the system panel with a pale face. In just 10 minutes, the number had dropped from 1,200 to 400. The tide of darkness was getting closer and closer. He looked up at his teammates, unable to bear the pressure. "What should we do?" "Hold it in. Don't move." Tian Minjing crouched behind the wall, gritted his teeth, and replied, "Don't move. We'll die if we move." Outside, the streets were already in chaos. When all the ascendants were suppressed by the tide of darkness and had to gather in the central area, the battle inevitably broke out. No, it should be said that just as everyone thought and expected, the battle began smoothly and normally. The chaos and danger of the battle were beyond everyone's expectations. But what was more terrifying than the contestants were the monsters that came out of nowhere. It was as if he had unintentionally barged into the lair of a man-eating creature. As the thin fog spread, everything became mournful and horrifying. Formless ghosts wandered in the fog, and sharp, inhuman screeches kept coming from the sky. Something was roaring in anger. Fiery light swept across continuously, burning everything to ashes. Except for a dozen or so ferocious auras, all the other contestants could only huddle in the corner, guarding their meager trophies and waiting for the tide of calamity to pass. At least they would not lose everything. But the Abyss did not want their capital. Instead, it generously gave them more blood. Thick blood gushed out from the bottom of the broken manhole cover like a tidal wave, turning into a torrential rain that sprayed selflessly in all directions. Ugly tentacles grew out from the places where the blood dripped, choosing to devour the people around them. A large number of lifeless corpses wandered between the blood and the tentacles. The ministers, nobles, and generals who were still dressed in ancient clothes had now been transformed beyond recognition. Some had snake faces, some had 100 eyes, some had multiple legs, and some had turned into beasts. Some of the behemoths ran, shaking the whole street. Some came and went silently like ghosts. The only thing they had in common was the thirst in their eyes and the desire for the souls of living creatures. Beautiful, beautiful. The officials who were bathed in blood crawled on the corpses and sucked the blood elegantly, as if they were immersed in the joy of the banquet. Today's wine and dishes are exceptionally delicious. Bitter, bitter, dying from a broken carriage, bitter. Save me, Father. Don't send me to be a living sacrifice. I hate you so much, you trash. I hate you so much. Hoarse cries and laughter echoed in the dark street. The entire Yamatai city finally shed its disguise of the past, and the calamities and miracles that had been slumbering in the darkness were awakened. After intensifying, everything quickly turned into a nightmare. And in the deepest part of the nightmare, a cold howl suddenly rang out. That was the howl of a wolf. Heaven and earth froze. As that distant howl gradually approached, outside the fog, above the blood-red sky, a dazzling star fell down, transforming into a pure white giant wolf, landing in front of Yishuaya. As countless white hairs fluttered in the wind, a holy and dignified aura rose from the body of the white wolf. The countless tentacles that grew out of the sun, which embryo, under the gaze of the white wolf, were cleanly cut into two. The cut was swift and fierce, without any signs of life, turning into ashes in the air. Yishuaya was stunned for a moment, then began to laugh happily. This time, the old man has finally bled a lot. She stretched out her hand, and the white wolf soared into the air, transforming into a shell of starlight, breaking apart inch by inch. What replaced it was a white light so dazzling that it was difficult to look straight at, falling into her hand. A rainbow pierced through the sun. Such an illusion suddenly appeared in everyone's consciousness. The gentle white wolf, with the Tao, will swim. The talisman has changed, is the spirit hook. Following Yishuaya's chanting, this weapon that had followed the blackbird for a long time burst forth with a frightening aura. The white light condensed, forming a strange long hook. Stinking woman, prepare to say goodbye to your past. As if it was the flow of fate, the divinity that represented the change of fate was attached to the edge of the long hook. Amidst Yishuaya's laughter, it slashed towards the rotten face of the sun, which embryo. Eat my life's rebirth hook. Heaven and earth split apart. A dog barking? In the darkness, Huaisha raised his head in astonishment, looking at the sky shrouded in darkness and thick fog. Immediately after, he heard a tragic howl burst forth, like a disfigured woman, so vicious that it was frightening. Soon, an endless rain of blood, separated by the dark clouds, splashed down. The pungent blood carried a strange vitality that permeated through every opening. Wherever it landed, clumps of flesh and blood would immediately grow out of the mud and bricks, choosing to devour the people around them. Accompanied by the collapse of the jade fence, the main door of the main hall opened with a bang. The eerie sound of the divine music bell and the ghostly singing and dancing spread in all directions. Under the cold candlelight, the heavenly officials with their backs to the door and the witch dancing in front of the fire all turned their heads, almost turning 180 degrees. On their stiff and pale faces, a pair of blank eyes stared fixedly at the sudden visitor. The aura that made Huaisha shudder just now was emitted from their bodies. At first glance, they looked so handsome. Each person's face was flawless, but immediately after, from the deathly paleness that only appeared on corpses, an indescribable abnormality could be felt. As if pieced together from countless fragments, each perfect face was constantly changing. In the end, even with the naked eye, it was difficult to distinguish whether what one saw was an illusion or something else. One would only be attracted by the chill that was like a grave, involuntarily wanting to throw oneself into it. Still not enough. Your offerings are still not enough. Among the mournful screams in the sky, the heavenly officials in charge of the ceremony opened their mouths and spoke in a stiff voice, as if they were extremely frightened, but they did not put any emotion into it. Fury of the netherworld. Thus, the heavenly officials, and which assisting in the ceremony, screamed in hunger and thirst. Shengji, Shengji, Shengji. If you want a promotion, please go to the Human Resources Department, okay? Huaishir, who was hiding behind the heavenly officials, shook his head indifferently. What does this have to do with our cold and heartless legal department? Boom! The group of heavenly officials did not want to say any more nonsense. With an expression that said, all pirates should die, they raised their briefcases and took the lead to smash them down on the heavenly officials in front of them. In an instant, the heavenly officials' robes were torn apart, and a hideous and ugly giant spider broke out of its shell, frantically poking at the heavenly officials with its limbs. Then, one shell after another shattered. The beautiful skin was torn apart, and the products that had been brewing inside broke out of the shell, bathed in sticky blood, and screeched. Huaishir was flabbergasted at the sight of this group of demons holding a meeting. They had already become like this, but they still wanted to fight for a promotion. Your department was really too ruthless. If they worked harder, they would probably be rated as one of the top 100 companies in hell. At the back, Huaishir only had time to complain before his gaze was attracted by the object enshrined on the deity throne. It seemed to be the remains of some ancient artifact. The irregularly shaped copper plate was only the size of a palm. Its surface was smooth and flat, as if it had come from copper mirror. There were also faded patterns on the edges. The gold that adorned it had already been replaced by bronze rust. It had been through a lot, but the lens looked empty and ethereal. Not only did it not reflect anything, it seemed like a gap in space that led to an unknown place. Countless rainbows flashed through it, and bubbles appeared and disappeared. In its reflection, the world was empty. Now, the broken lens was enshrined on the deity throne, and had already been connected to the entire palace through the sacrifice. It was continuously absorbing the origin substance that was offered by the sacrifice, and it emitted an indescribable glow, forming a membrane that covered the entire palace. A relic from the border? Or a fragment of the philosopher's stone? Huaishir couldn't tell. But one thing he was sure of was that this thing was definitely a good thing. Just looking at it, there was an indescribable thirst emerging from his heart. He wanted to get it, to own it, to occupy it, to devour it. Mine. The mountain ghost stigmata was so excited that it was about to go crazy. The greedy desire of the same origin made Huaishir's eyes burn red in an instant. His gaze was fixed on a copper plate, and he couldn't move it away anymore. No, he had to find a way to F***ck it. Huaishir rubbed his hands crazily, and his heart was ready to commit crimes again. Anyway, the celestial genealogy was one of his own here. It was only right for him to take his own things. He didn't even need to pay to go to the kitten paradise. What's wrong with taking your broken mirror? This logic was simply too good, and a little carelessness would cost him his life. So he had to think twice before he acted. Taking advantage of the chaotic struggle between the Ministry of Justice and the priests and witches, Huaishir lurked in the shadows and slowly moved forward. The specific method was to rely on the talent of the ghost to disappear his body, and then hold the round fan in front of his eyes and say in his heart, "You can't see me, you can't see me." Not sure if this ostrich strategy was particularly effective, or if the Allies' offensive was too strong. Huaishir held the increasingly broken round fan and hid in the shadows where the candlelight couldn't reach. He jumped up and down, circled forward, and crept past the edge of the compound several times. The divine position was getting closer and closer, and the bronze mirror shook as if it was waving at him. It released a light. Under the light, Huaishir couldn't help but bounce out of the shadows. In his hand, the round fan shook, and flames ignited out of thin air, instantly burning the broken fan into ashes, leaving only the grip in Huaishir's hand. It's over, the whole broken main hall ushered in a suffocating moment. In the chaotic battle of demons and ghosts, a sneaky teenager holding a bald fan in his hand suddenly jumped out, and he had already touched the front of the divine position. Aware of the shocked gazes from all directions, Huaishir turned his head stiffly and showed an awkward but polite smile. The next moment, the teenager swung his axe and jumped, splitting open the deformed priest in front of him. "What are you looking at?" Huaishir turned back and roared fiercely at the priests. "Why aren't you thanking Brother Huaishir?" Chapter 281. According to the rules, at this time, someone should stutter and say, thank you, Brother Huaishir." Then Huaishir looked around and said to them, "What's the use of wearing a suit and showing off your big brother's phone? Scare, follow the boss, and eat shit, lay." Finally, he left. However, none of this happened. It only existed in Huaishir's beautiful illusion. Not only did they not feel afraid, but they also showed an expression that they wanted to rush up and have a taste. The sudden silence only lasted for a moment, but Huaishir's main attack was seized by the Dark Good Brother, who was the leader of the legal department. He suddenly raised the briefcase like a sledgehammer and smashed it on the head of the earth spider. Slurry burst out, and then several people pressed the earth spider to the ground. Some pulled its legs, some pulled its head, and quickly dismembered the officiator. It really made people wonder what this group of ghosts from the legal department was doing. After a brief moment of silence, countless furious screams rang out. All of the monsters pounced on Huaishir without any regard for their own safety. It was as if they had gone mad. It was like poking a wild donkey's nest. It made Huaishir's scalp tingle. Before that, he had already sensed the chill from the sky through the premonition of death. He ran forward and used steps with all his strength. Thunder rumbled. A hurricane burst forth from beneath his feet, leaving behind afterimages. Huaishir instantly disappeared from her original spot, breaking through the air in front of her. W steps. The axe cleaved open the enchantment formed by the salt circle on the ground. Salt powder flew out like iron sand, piercing dozens of bloody holes in his body. Ignoring the killing intent radiating from the symbols of the 10 divine treasures, Huaishir turned around in midair and threw the rope of sorrows at the copper mirror, despite being blocked by the 2 witches. The iron chain whistled out with sparks and black smoke, and instantly walked in a flexible zigzag shape in the air. The iron rings rubbed against each other, bursting out a shrill and sharp sound. In an instant, it coiled around the deity's seat and contracted. The runes hanging around the deity throne lit up and forced out a halo, blocking the fragments of the bronze mirror, making it difficult for the shrinking chain to cross the short distance. But in midair, Huaishir abruptly pulled on the chain, dodging the sharp claws of Miko-sama that were aimed at his neck. The spear of compassion appeared in his other hand, and the glorious light of 400 years of history condensed into steel. Following Huaishir's roar, the spear pierced downwards. Open! The halo shook violently and shattered. The chains retracted and instantly pulled the copper mirror fragment away from the deity position and rolled back. At that moment, a furious roar sounded. The sky above his head suddenly shattered, and a rotting giant hand covered in maggots descended from the sky, as if it wanted to crush this fly that dared to touch its treasure. The surrounding dark figures from the legal department suddenly stretched out like chopsticks and raised their hands to block the giant rotten hand. However, in less than a second, those Dark Good Brothers were crushed by the giant hand. A biting wind pressure came from across the air. A chill from the soul burst forth, and Huaishir's vision darkened. He felt that his soul was about to shatter under the crushing pressure of this giant hand. Is there still a boss? This is the end of me. At that moment, as the chain rapidly contracted, the broken mirror fragment finally touched Huaishir's fingertips. Then everything froze. Time stood still. Whether it was the cold light that flew out from the offerings that represented the 10 divine treasures, or the rotting giant hand that slapped down from the dark sky, or the collapsing main hall, or even the ferocious creatures that were flying towards him from all directions, all of them were different. Huaisher saw a wisp of sparks pass by in front of him and condense in the air. He felt that he was suspended in mid-air, as if he was flying. The ripples of the wind distorted the swaying candle flame, and the scattered light illuminated the broken bronze mirror. But the fragments of the bronze mirror illuminated Huaisher's face. In the fleeting reflection in the mirror, Huaisher saw that his body was rapidly dimming and dissipating, replaced by a mountain ghost burning with green flames. In the crack in his chest, the blazing flame of the soul spewed out. It was a silent call. As a result, the bronze mirror was broken and quickly collapsed, leaving only a wisp of iron dust gathered from copper rust. A torrent swept from his fingertips and poured into Huaisher's soul. The core formed by the intertwining of the divine mark and the soul emerged again. The broken outline of the bronze mirror was no longer there. Instead, it overlapped with the crack in his chest and turned into a perfect circle in his soul. It was like this from the beginning. They were integrated into one. They formed a perfect reflection and could not be distinguished from each other. Through the gap in his chest, his consciousness seemed to have become a mirror, reflecting everything in an instant and then peering into the essence of all things. Whether it was the rotten hand above his head that was formed by the combination of the premature child and the sun wizard, the divine priests around him who had lost themselves and turned into corpses, or the dark shadow of the Ministry of Justice formed purely by obsession. There were also the palace eroded by flesh and blood, the stinking wind, the dark sky, and the animated earth. Under the reflection of the bronze mirror, everything was fleeting like a fleeting bubble. It was difficult to perceive any sense of reality. Through the reflection in the mirror, it was as clear and distant as watching a fire from the other side of the river. The world was illusory. Then what was the scene in the mirror? Was it an illusion within an illusion? What was he, who was integrated into the bronze mirror? Was it an illusion within an illusion? If it was nothingness, then where did the illusion come from? If it was a dream, then where was he? Endless questions flashed through his mind. In the end, they formed an indescribable understanding and understanding. He understood what nothingness was. This was the true essence of nothingness. In his daze, he suddenly felt the ability of premonition of death suddenly knock on the surface of the mirror. It was like a hammer, without any warning or clue. In a short moment of stillness, he saw everything in the mirror of nothingness that was regarded as illusory start to move on its own. Huaisher fell from the sky. First, he was pierced full of holes by the light of the 10 divine treasures. Then, the giant hand completely crushed the good brother of darkness beside him, completely smashing him into a pile of meat paste. In the end, he was divided and eaten by the surrounding demons and ghosts. It was a tragic sight. The originally incomprehensible scene was transformed into a comprehensible scene in a flash. In just a short moment, he felt a wave of weakness. In his body, more than half of the originally chaotic and enormous vitality was violently extracted by the mirror as the price for this prophecy. In the end, before the scene completely faded, an illusory path appeared from the mirror. That was his only way out. In the next moment, the frozen time began to surge mightily. Huaisher roared, ignoring the sharp cold light that was coming at him from all directions. He swung the spear in his hand and thrust it downwards with all his might. The steel spear shaft was instantly bent into an arc, and his body bounced up like a pole vaulter. The tip of his nose brushed past the cold light that was enough to tear him to shreds. He soared into the air, courting his own death as he met the large hand that was coming at him. He threw out the rope of sorrow with his left hand. It wedged deeply into the broken corridor pillar and suddenly contracted. It pulled his body and flew to the side. Like a nimble fly, it flew out from between the fingers of a child who died prematurely. If it was just a hair's breadth away, he would be torn into pieces. But he did not expect that the moment he passed by, the snake-like maggots on the back of his hand suddenly jumped up. A few of them bit his shoulders and thighs, injecting fierce poison. The giant hand slammed down with a bang. A terrifying wave of chi burst forth from the collision. A hurricane swept out, instantly tearing apart the materialized form and black shadow nearby. Huaishir instantly lost feeling in half of his body. Immediately afterwards, a shock wave of origin substance came from the wind. It was just a simple attack, but it would not stop until he was dead. Huaishir had no way of resisting. He only felt his vision go black, and he fainted. In the last moment, he subconsciously pulled out the sword at his waist and slashed downwards. "Big brother, save me." The hanging curtain shattered under the trampling of the iron hooves. Big brother had come. A sudden neigh came from the void. A handsome white horse leapt out from the darkness. It opened its mouth and suddenly bit Huaishir's collar, flinging the unconscious youth onto its back. Immediately afterwards, the iron hooves stomped on the materialized face in front of it and rose into the air. Without any warning, it turned at a right angle, defying gravity and galloping between the walls and pillars. The monsters in the main hall screamed miserably. They reached out to pull the white horse back, but they could not even touch the edge of the white shadow. In just an instant, it rushed out of the main hall and broke through the invisible restraints. It neighed loudly. A mournful scream came from the sky. The sun, which embryo convulsed in pain and covered its rotting face. On its face, the originally beautiful left eye that was as bright as the moon disappeared. All that was left was a pitch-black hole with blood oozing out of it. Without the suppression of the bronze mirror in the shrine, countless cracks appeared on the membrane above the palace, and it was instantly riddled with holes. In the collapsed main hall, all the monsters' movements paused. They whined and melted into blood. After surviving for a long time by relying on the fragments of the bronze mirror, they welcomed their own end. They had completely perished in this cruel hell. Ignoring the giant rotting hand that angrily fumbled, rummaged, and destroyed, the shadows of the legal department in the ruins quietly watched the white horse leave until it disappeared into the darkness. On Tori, the lawyer's letter finally burned out, and all the shadows instantly disappeared without a trace. It was as if they had never been here. Only a hand with a doll cover suddenly reached out from the darkness and groped for the border relics in the fragments. It instantly plundered everything and retracted before the big hand angrily slammed down. "Slip away, slip away." The sun, which embryo raised its head and roared. Countless poisonous flames condensed into 3 sun-like backlights that appeared behind it. It crazily scattered a large number of destructive rays in a certain direction in the distance. The rays instantly crossed a long distance and came to the sky above the kitten paradise. They turned into a rainstorm of death and fell from the sky. A rainbow suddenly rose from the castle of the paradise and shrouded the sky above the paradise. It took the angry attack of the sun, which embryo. Then the kitten's smug laughter came. "We've been neighbors for so many years, and you're still so enthusiastic before you leave. How can I accept this?" The kitten held a cigarette in its mouth and waved at the furious sun, which embryo. "Then I'll go first. Take care of yourself." Along with the cold sound of a pipa, an ox cart drove into the park at the last moment. Then the gate of the paradise closed with a bang. Then there was an earth-shattering roar. The huge paradise shook violently. It jumped on the spot and rose an insignificant 3 inches. Then it fell again, and in this short gap, an unbelievably huge corrugated box appeared in the void around it. It actually sealed the entire paradise. As the top fan of the box closed, a huge roll of tape appeared from the void. The seal was completed. Then the corrugated box began to shrink rapidly until finally, in the huge hole in the ground, only a box of less than 2 meters in length, width, and height was left. The logo of yesterday's express appeared on the box. "The package service you ordered has been completed. All that was missing was a driver." Outside the bloody hole in the sky, the glimmer of light that had been lingering for a long time suddenly shook. The glimmer of light quickly enlarged, enlarged, and enlarged. In the end, it turned into a huge, pure gold chariot. It bathed in flames like a corona and charged into the hole in the sky. In an instant, it whizzed past the battle between the sun, which embryo, and Yishuya. It did not pay any attention to it at all, as if there was no one around. It was like a scorching sun moving on its own track, with a tyrannical and biting cold aura. If the sun, which was only an embryo now, then this bright chariot was like the incarnation of the real sun. It was majestic, insufferably arrogant. Level 5 stigmata relic, Helios chariot. No, it should be called the Helios workshop. No one would have thought that this alchemy workshop, which had always been known for being mysterious and cold, would suddenly barge into Yamatai City. Taking advantage of the gap between the two sides, it directly threw out a chain and pulled the Paradise package that weighed hundreds of millions of tons. It rose into the air and broke through the sky again. It would never return. It's leaving just like that. Outside Yamatai City, under the reflection of countless stars, the black bird in the void looked down and saw the kitten waving goodbye on the huge chariot. Forget it. Since you're leaving, then goodbye. The old man looked away indifferently. He raised his huge wings a little and opened a path, allowing the sun-like chariot to escape and disappear into the endless hell. They never saw each other again. Chapter 282. In the shadows, Big Bone panted violently as he stared blankly at the approaching black tide. Like an iron wall that held up the sky, it was already right in front of him. In this hellish environment, staring at death inch by inch, no matter how strong one's mind was, it would be hard to resist the arrival of despair, right? But just as he was about to ignore the dangers lurking outside and plan to escape from his hiding place, he found that the turbulent black tide had stopped. The shrinking Shinue framework regained its stability, and all the power overlapped in this city that was incomparably narrow compared to the original terrifying area. The black tide that retreated was only an inch away from the tip of his nose. Life and death were hanging by a thread. Cold sweat dripped from Big Bone's forehead as he panted violently. Only then did he realize that the screams and ghostly cries outside had disappeared without a trace. Dead silence arrived. Only bursts of thunder and howls could be heard coming from behind the iron-like dark clouds in the sky. The white wolf roared, and heaven and earth shook, but this narrow world regained its peace. In the long and uneasy silence, the survivors looked at each other. "It's over." Big Bone swallowed and looked at his teammate. Tian Minjing hesitated for a moment. Probably 40. In the end, the number of surviving contestants stopped at this extremely small number and then disappeared. Instead, at the end of the street, in front of the dilapidated palace, a ray of light rose from the ground. The light expanded and extended, turning into an arched corridor, and in it, an ancient door opened with a bang, waiting for the survivors to come. The door of victory. Tian Minjing was stunned for a moment, and his voice was a little out of tune. The door of victory is open. The cruel battle royale was finally over. They could finally leave this unending nightmare with their spoils of war. The two of them panted violently, wiped their faces, and tried hard to suppress their fluctuating emotions. They almost couldn't help but hug each other and cry. "Let's go, bring the equipment." Big Bone couldn't wait to carry the bag and patted his teammate's shoulder. In just a few days, two strangers who had never met each other had become trustworthy teammates. It was like a miracle. "When we go back and come to the northeast, I'll treat you to lick iron bars and stewed pork with vermicelli. Don't celebrate too early." Carrying his backpack, Tian Minjing carefully stuck his head out and stared at the dead silent street. But he did not find any obstacles or dangers. He immediately raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Sai, I thought that according to the nature of the organizing committee, they would let us escape into the door while being chased by demons and ghosts. I didn't expect it to be so easy. It's fine as long as we can pass. Let's go, let's go." Big Bone couldn't wait any longer. A contestant like him, who was only here to join in the fun, did not expect to be ranked in the first place. Entering the top 72 was already a pleasant surprise. How could he ask for more? However, when he took a step forward, everything in front of him suddenly changed. This was not some dangerous illusion, because the gate of victory was still open, right where it was without any changes or movements. As long as one stepped through it, they would be able to leave this place. But as everything in front of him instantly shed its disguise, he smelled the thick stench of blood that almost suffocated him. The shocking crimson color covered every inch of space on the street. The sewer was already blocked, and the blood that submerged the soles of the feet rippled, constantly washing away the pale and distorted faces and the corpses everywhere. Whether it was the ferocious monsters, the strange ghosts, or the creepy abyssal mutants, at this moment, all the living creatures had fallen apart, brutally chopped into pieces and thrown on the street. Together with Judge Jean, who was dropped by countless contestants. Big Bone was stunned in place. He was shocked by the sea of blood and the mountain of corpses in front of him. He was frozen in the cold, trembling. It was as if a sick grandmother had finally shed her disguise and turned into a hungry wolf. Everything became unbelievable. But in the end, when he finally noticed the figure walking in the blood, he didn't know why, but there was a sense of relief in his heart. He finally understood. The reason why the monsters disappeared. It was because an even more terrifying monster had appeared in front of him. Luo Xian turned her head and seemed to be stunned. Are there still rats hiding here? In the dead silence, Big Bone was frozen in place. He looked at her walking towards him step by step. He should have escaped, or at least resisted, and fought to the death. But he didn't know why. Just looking at that white dress, he felt that his consciousness was about to be torn apart, and he fell into that seemingly gentle smile. He melted into the endless darkness. What is this thing? He closed his eyes and heard the sound of his skull breaking from his teammates' terrified screams. The sound of breaking was heard twice, followed by the dull sound of falling to the ground. Luo Xian raised her hand and wiped away the blood that fell on her face. Finally, for the time being, it has come to an end. She heaved a long sigh, bent down, and struggled to pull out the broken blade from the broken skull. She staggered back a step, as if she had exhausted all her strength. Then, she turned her head and asked softly, "Little Amber, where are you going?" In the dead silence, the girl who quietly slipped away from the shadows was frozen in place. After a long time, she slowly turned her head, and her expression twitched, and then twitched again, and finally squeezed out a smile with difficulty. "Sister, Xian? Long time no see. You've grown taller." Luo Xian tilted her head and looked at her and suddenly asked, "Do you hate me? I thought that acquaintances would at least say hello when they see each other." Amber's expression froze for a moment, and she was silent, not knowing how to answer. No, it should be said that she didn't know how to explain the disgust that she wanted to hide from the bottom of her heart. Yes, she hated Luo Xian. From the first time she saw her, she hated her. It was the conclusion and discovery that a person with a sinister heart instinctively made when they speculated about other people. Perhaps different people had different viewpoints. When one's heart was filled with pain and curses, everything one saw was darkness and despair. However, when Hoopa saw Luo Xian's smiling face in his most painful moment, he never dared to look her in the eye again. She knew that she was afraid of Luo Xian. It was far more than she was afraid of the master craftsman's strictness and brutality. A beast would be wary of a beast from the bottom of her heart, especially when it was a monster that she absolutely couldn't resist or fight against. It was even more so. I'm not hostile." Seeing Luo Xian dragging her katana and walking towards her step by step, Amber subconsciously took a step back and raised her hands nervously. She felt cold sweat seeping out from her back. Luo Xian looked at her in confusion, and her eyes were puzzled. "But I do." He saw Upo's body stiffen for a moment, then he slowly relaxed. As if she finally understood something, she exhaled the anxious breath in her heart and said to herself, "In other words, I have no choice but to do this." No one answered. Luo Xian just smiled and looked at her. So, Amber's eyes gradually turned cold. Then, she reached out and pulled out a wakizashi that was in her way and casually threw it on the ground. Then, her right hand held the handle of the katana at her waist. The blazing breath was like a pure white cloud that rose from the thin blood mist and covered her face. Only a pair of pitch-black eyes were left. Silent like a piece of iron, there was no longer any hesitation. "Please come at me." Then, Luo Xian came over. 1 step, 2 steps. Hu Po's fingers twitched for a moment, but then they relaxed again. Then, facing the bone-piercing chill, Luo Xian took a 3rd step and paused for a moment. With the 4th step, she finally stepped into the range of the katana's reach. No, distance was meaningless to Hu Po to begin with. Her soul ability could perfectly correct the blade difference. Within 10 meters, there was no such thing as the best distance and the limit of strength. Even if there was only a gap, it was enough for her to calmly swing her sword. But she didn't move. Her 5 fingers on the hilt clenched several times, but they relaxed again helplessly. She couldn't find any gap. She was lost in the tidal wave of qi around Luo Xian. Cold sweat dripped from her forehead, and she was drenched in sweat. She wasn't confident. Facing that gentle smile, she didn't have the courage to draw her sword. She just stopped herself from trembling and used all her strength. She stiffened on the spot, until the two of them brushed past each other. In the dead silence, Amber lowered her eyes, and her hand tiredly loosened from the hilt. She sighed softly. She expressed her gratitude from the bottom of her heart. "Thank you. Isn't this what a senior sister should do?" Luo Xian looked back at her and continued forward. A line of blood suddenly appeared on the back of Amber's fair neck. Following that, along with the scarlet diagonal line, her neck smoothly tilted to the side. Blood spurted out. Was it so beautiful to behead someone in a row? Amidst the drowsiness of weightlessness, Amber closed her eyes. It was really a complete loss. In the dead silence of the venue, everyone quietly stared at this brutal massacre. They suppressed the sound of their breaths, as if they were watching a horror movie and could empathize with the scene. On the big screen, the number of contestants continued to slide down steadily. In the end, there were only 13 contestants left. Then it became 12. 11. The deaths continued. As Luo Xian moved forward, they fell in front of each opponent equally and mercifully. In the end, no one could be found. Luo Xian returned to the street, took out a white apron from her pocket, and changed into a gray smock. She picked up a mop and a broom, and slowly cleaned up the tragic scene. She was as skilled as a maid who came out of nowhere. She dragged the corpses over and piled them in one place. She opened up the sewer and drained the blood. Finally, she carefully swept the broken remains and flesh together, shoveled them into a dustpan, and dumped them into the trash can. Finally, she washed them with water. After cleaning the floor, she wiped the stained glass, hung the bloodstains on the wall, watered the plants, and put the mop and broom back in the alley. The maid's work was done beautifully. She moved a chair and sat in front of the victory door that led to the ending, quietly waiting for the next visitor. So slow. That guy. She rested her chin on her palm and patiently stared at the end of the street. Could he have died in some unknown place? Was his luck that good? The melancholy Luo Xian sighed softly. She really couldn't be happy. Chapter 283. Oh my God, am I going to die? Huaishir opened his eyes from the intense pain and gasped for breath. He felt an indescribable thirst and pain. His sage mark felt like it was about to shatter. He was short on origin substance, and his vision was dark. Then, a translucent shadow floated over from the side. It was like a shadow condensed from ashes. A pair of dim eyes quietly stared at him, expressionless. Huaishir was so scared that he almost jumped up from the ground. That is, if he could still jump up. Very quickly, the gray shadow dissipated, forming the red glove's blank face. Huaishir gasped for breath for a long time, coughing violently. How did you become like that? Like what? The red glove looked at him, puzzled. I haven't changed at all. Bullshit, you obviously. Huaishir hadn't finished speaking when the red glove in front of him changed again. This time, he finally discovered that the red glove wasn't the only one that had changed. He had changed as well. After that mysterious copper mirror had merged with his soul, his eyes seemed to have changed. When he focused, he could easily see through the surface of things, reflect the essence. However, The origin substance that he had managed to recover with great difficulty was sucked dry again after a few glances. And just by taking a quick glance, he saw cracks in his bones, as well as countless tiny things that looked like worms swimming about. They were like parasites residing in his blood. He lowered his head and looked at his miserable upper body. His left leg had been smashed to the edge by the large, rotting hand, and then shattered into several pieces. His body was covered in countless wounds, and he had almost died on the spot. The most serious injuries were the places where the maggots had bitten him. Dark gray poison wrapped around the wounds, and even his own poison resistance couldn't dispel it. Through the translucent flesh, he could see the dense group of parasites sprouting in the wounds, and his own sage mark, which was dimly operating. No matter how he looked at it, he looked like he was about to die. If the red glove hadn't sensed that he was in danger and rushed over in time to take over the injured white horse and make emergency treatment, he probably would have left in shock. Suck! Red Gloves opened the basket beside him, grabbed a handful of leaves, and stuffed them into Huaishi's hand. Unlike Huaishi, who had been severely injured by the sun which embryo and had almost died for nothing, the Red Gloves seemed to have gained a lot. The basket on his back was already filled to the brim with various plants that Huaishi did not recognize. Some of them were even full of vitality, which surprised him. Among them, there were about 40 types of precious abyssal plants that were full of vitality. The others were also types that Huaishi had never seen before. They were all branches, leaves, and fruits that had been plucked off. Huaishi simply didn't pay attention to them. He grabbed a handful and sucked them all in one breath. After eating half a basket, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Beside him, the Red Gloves had found a crucible from somewhere, and there was already a boiling sound. "What's that?" Huaishi asked. "It's the butterfly incense from India. I found some tobacco leaves and spices there, and I tried to make some." As Red Glove spoke, his hands did not stop moving. He poured the sticky glue in the small crucible into a simple filter. In the end, the residue in the filter quickly turned into a gray powder. The powder was mixed in the dried tobacco leaves and mixed evenly. Then he poured in the juice extracted from the border plants, mixed it, and roughly squeezed into a sharp cone shape. A stick of incense was ready. This was the application of spices in alchemy. It was not in the field of metalworking that Huaishi specialized in. However, he could also see that the tools were too crude and the technique was not good. After wasting a lot of materials, the medicinal effect would not be too good. But it was enough. Metal repaired the body, and incense healed the soul. Silver blood medicine could heal wounds, and the incense produced by alchemy was mostly used to restore origin substances. Unfortunately, apart from a small amount of millennium incense, most incense could not produce origin substances out of thin air. They could only forcefully produce origin substances by stimulating the soul. It was like using adrenaline to get rid of sleepiness. Using too much of it was harmful. However, the situation was critical, so he could only make do. A pale white alchemy flame appeared on Huaishi's fingertips and fell on the top of the incense. In an instant, the white flames began to burn wildly. After swallowing up the entire incense, it was completely burned into dust that could no longer be used. What replaced it was a wisp of purified sky-blue smoke that entered Huaishi's nose. His face was visibly flushed, and large amounts of origin substance appeared in his empty soul, dispelling the drowsiness. After a rough estimate, he found that his mana bar had been filled by more than half, but his limit had been reduced by a bit. However, Huaishi's origin substance was at least 3 times more than other origin substances of the same tier. Considering the urgency of the situation, a bit less wouldn't be a big deal. At worst, he could just go back and meditate a few more times and recuperate for a while to make up for it. After crawling back from the brink of sudden death, Huaishi gasped for breath and wiped the sweat off his forehead. The parasite needs to be removed. This was the real problem. He thought for a moment, pulled out the sacrificial knife and the sword of virtue, and handed them to the Red Glove. "I'll command, you'll be the main knife. The small hammer will scratch the seam, and the big hammer will do it. Is there a problem?" The red glove silently took the knife and sword, waiting for his command. Sometimes, Huaisher would suspect that the red glove was still alive. After being given memories, the changes in the army's ghosts were like heaven and earth. They were so agile that it was as if the dead had been reborn. However, a dead person was dead, and it was impossible for them to be reborn. In front of him was only a sacred mark that carried the records of the dead. At best, it was like a moving tombstone. This was only the result of the fusion of the most basic record fragment and the sacred mark. If the kingdom of heaven still existed, the result of the fusion with a high-grade sacred mark, would it really be no different from the rebirth of the dead? Because of this, he could understand more and more that the fall of the kingdom of heaven was not without reason. Who would want to become someone else's puppet after death? This was even more objectionable than necromancers playing with corpses. This was probably not the only sin that the lunatic creators of the utopia had committed back then. The future division and collective consolidation had probably been foreshadowed a long time ago. Thinking of this, Huaisher couldn't help but sigh. He heard the sound of thunder behind the dark clouds in the sky. The gods were fighting. But no matter who won, it had nothing to do with a small, insignificant person like him. Although this was the case, in the end, it was most likely that the Ingzhou lineage would suffer a huge loss, right? Regardless of the size of the lineage, the degree of internal unity would be enough to know the result. Until now, he still didn't understand how useless the Ingzhou lineage was. How could there be so much internal strife? Even if the Gong family and the Wu family had been fighting for thousands of years, and even if they had a tradition of internal strife, they couldn't even work together under such strong external pressure. Now, even a 5th-level sacred mark could be plucked by the Dongxiao lineage. What a joke! That was a 5th-level sacred mark. It was different from the low-level sacred marks that could be created in batches with alchemy and bought with money. A 4th-level sacred mark was a true miracle of the world. It was a walking nuclear weapon that needed to be reported when entering and exiting the country. It was a human-shaped destructive cedar that would attract the attention of the astronomical society just by approaching the country's border. A demigod in the human world. How many 5th-level sacred marks were there in Ingzhou? 1? 2? Even if they were all idiots, there was no need for them to be so stupid, right? What were they thinking? But what did this have to do with him, a traitor in the astronomical society? While his mind was full of thoughts, Huaisher had already pointed out a few parasites that had begun to gnaw on his sacred mark with the clairvoyance hack that he had just obtained. The red glove drew his sword and slashed down. The sword of virtue accurately stabbed a wound. Then, with a flick of the broken blade, a worm was pulled out. The worm looked like an earthworm. Once it was pulled out, it hissed. But immediately, the sacrificial knife cut down and sucked its blood, causing it to shrivel into ashes. Even if it was entangled in the bone and couldn't be pulled out, after the blade of the sword cut the wound, the sacrificial knife directly stabbed in. Along with Huaisher's blood, the worm was directly sucked dry. The moment it lost its life, it was digested by the mountain ghost's sacred mark. With the help of the operation, the sacred mark that was difficult to operate instantly became smooth. Immediately, thousands of strands of source substance were separated from the body and began to strangle the foreign body. After continuous transformation, the source substance was endowed with the characteristics of a parasitic vine. It directly parasitized the parasites. In the end, Huaisher couldn't tell who was more ruthless and who was more evil. The red glove's movements were very fast. Within a few minutes, the old wound was healed. The numbness gradually faded, and it was replaced by bursts of pain of flesh and blood tearing. This was a small matter. First, the bone was set, then the silver blood potion was applied to seal the wound. Finally, the mountain ghost hugged a tree and sucked it madly. The empty HP bar was recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. As for the poison that was entangled in his body, Huaisher thought for a moment and simply took out the pike of compassion, stabbing it twice at the place where the poison had infected. After the blue-crowned dragon's decay poison had degraded most of the poison and forced it to expire, the rest was within the scope of Huaisher's treatment. As for the blue-crowned dragon's poison, he had the crow's antidote, so it wasn't a problem. After one round of playing with poison, Huaishir basically recovered from his weakened state. This was the good thing about the mountain ghost. Basically, as long as it didn't die on the spot, it could always be pulled back. After recovering a little, Huaishir's death-seeking heart began to stir again. After hesitating, he thought for a moment and said to the red glove, "Stab me." The red glove didn't say anything. He raised the sacrificial knife and stabbed at Huaishir's heart. The speed of the movement and the fierceness of the attack were simply outrageous. Chapter 284. According to Huaishir's conjecture, the red glove should have first expressed some refusal or doubt before carrying out his orders. But he didn't expect that after becoming a tool, the red glove would be so obedient. Without the three principles of being a tool, even if Huaishir told him to jump into the Huangpu River, he wouldn't have objected. The blade instantly made Huaishir jump in fright. When Huaishir finally reacted, with a thought, the sacrificial blade that had pierced his chest stopped abruptly and was pulled out. He frowned. Sure enough, it didn't work. He didn't know if it was because he had already expected it or if the red glove's position wasn't high enough. But even if the premonition of death was activated, the mirror of nothingness didn't produce any images or warnings. This move was sometimes effective and sometimes not, which was always worrying. Could it be that only the pressure of a rank 5 powerhouse could forcefully activate it? Wasn't this a bit too unstable? But no matter what, he had gained a clairvoyance hack for free, so it wasn't a loss. After resting for a while, he felt that he had finally recovered a bit. He checked his equipment and prepared to follow the guidance of the mission bread and head to the Gate of Victory. This rookie competition wasn't in vain. He had earned quite a bit. With a happy mood, Huaishir wore the red glove and wandered on the road home. He didn't know why, but his heart inexplicably turned cold. The premonition of death fell from the sky. Immediately after, Huaishir saw. In the mirror, there was an endless darkness. In the boiling darkness, it was as if there was a cruel eye that was high up in the sky, casting an indifferent glance at him from countless worlds away. The image flashed, and Huaishir woke up from the dizziness caused by the sudden loss of blood, staring blankly in place. What the hell? Who am I? Where am I? Who the hell wants to kill me? Why am I going to die again? Moreover, which powerhouse wants to mess with me again? What kind of person is thinking about me again? In this baffling situation, Huaishir once again felt stupefied. Countless question marks appeared on his head. Why did a pot fall from the sky when he was just participating in a rookie competition? Why are you persecuting me again? The almighty crow, Pull-a-Dream, was still pretending to be dead. Huaishir had no idea what was going on. Do you have any leads? He asked the red gloves. The red gloves looked at him coldly, with an expression that said, I don't know how to explain to you that I'm just a tool. Huaishir could not help but sigh helplessly. All right, you can continue to be responsible for carrying the luggage. Huaishir hung all his belongings on his body and walked forward lightly. He was extremely alert, his palm pressed on the sword of virtue, and he continued to walk forward vigilantly. After taking 2 steps, he froze on the spot. He rubbed his eyes again and again. It was unbelievable. What's this? He pulled the red gloves next to him and pointed at the thing at the fork in the road. The red gloves glanced at it and answered stiffly, Relics from the border. I know this is a relic from the border, but why? Why would it appear here? Huaishir opened his eyes wide, squatting on the ground at the fork in the road. He suspiciously looked at the relic from the border that was thrown on the ground. It could be said to be luxurious ribs, with a faint fragrance on it, as if it had been worn by a soft and fragrant lady for a long time. He did not know why, but the appearance of amber appeared in his mind. I've seen a ghost. Huaishir could not help but shake his head. How rich was this woman to throw a relic worth at least a few million US dollars everywhere? He casually picked it up and threw it to the red gloves. Put it in the basket and keep it. He continued to walk forward, and then at the next fork in the road, he froze in place and continued to rub his eyes. Did he see another relic from the border? An old flintlock pistol with an ancient aura was lying on the ground. It had been placed in a box, and it looked very precious. In some embarrassing game, it would be at least +7, right? Can this thing be thrown away casually? He froze for a moment, glanced around, and did not see the owner. After thinking for a long time, he could not resist the temptation of money, picked up the gun, and stuffed it into his pocket. He continued to walk forward. Then at the next fork, he saw another relic from the border. A bracelet. I'm shocked. What the hell is this? Huaishir was stunned. He thought for a moment and felt that this was some kind of situation, but in the end, he still chose it. He picked it up, kicked it into his backpack, and continued to walk forward. The further he went, the more relics from the border on the ground, the more expensive they were, and the more beautiful they looked. It was as if the sky was throwing money. Relics from the border that were hard to find and worth tens of thousands of dollars were now scattered all over the ground. Huaishir was too lazy to bend over when he encountered cheap goods, but he still stuffed a full bag. He felt that this world was simply too strange. Inexplicably, they began to give out big discounts at the end of the year. Do you have any clues? Huaishir turned around and asked the red gloves. The red gloves still had an expression that said, I'm a tool, and I don't know what you're talking about. The basket on his back was already filled with guns and cannons picked up along the way. Huaishir lowered his head and looked at the equipment in his backpack, and then looked at the relics on the ground that stretched all the way to the front, turning left and right to the Gate of Victory, and so on. It felt like a trap with corn to trick sparrows into jumping into. Who would be fooled by this kind of trick? Huaishir lowered his head and continued to pick up the good things on the ground. He moved forward step by step, turning left and right. He hated that he did not bring a few more bags. Now he could only pick up and throw away one item after another like a bear in a cornfield. His heart was bleeding. It's too wasteful, too wasteful. He sadly threw away a weapon, picked up a pair of boots from the ground, and stuffed them into his basket. Too wasteful. Click. A crisp sound came from the darkness in the distance. Huaishir raised his head in shock and subconsciously crawled on the ground. Then he saw the blazing flames converging into a chain and whistling over in an instant with a burst of roar. The iron fire turned into a torrential rain, tearing the walls apart layer by layer. The whip of thunder and fire swept across, instantly tearing apart the walls and buildings, sweeping everything on the street into pieces. The Red Glove's reaction was stiff. He was a beat slower and turned into pieces under the crazy firepower. All the equipment he picked up flew into the sky and was immediately torn into countless pieces under the rapid and violent firepower. Huaishir was dumbfounded. How could he not know what this thing was? But in this hell, where did such a heavy machine gun with such exaggerated firepower come from? It should be known that the common firearms manufactured in batches based on the rules of the present realm were often difficult to use smoothly at the border or in hell. It was still okay at the border, and they were often stuck or something. But in hell, which did not have the great mystic instrument, Zarathustra, they were often greeted with self-destruction or simply turned into a pile of scrap iron under the erosion of the abyss sediment. Any firearm that could be used in hell was often a treasure that had been passed down in the present realm for a long time, or a precious semi-relic of the border type that had been endowed with a small mystic instrument by alchemy. As an independent miracle, they were almost not inferior to the stigmata relics of the same level. If used properly, they were more than enough to kill 1 or 2 grade 4. Why would someone use a cannon to kill a mosquito? Although his mind was in a mess, Huaishir's movements did not stop. After quickly getting rid of the burden, he hid behind layers of walls until the roaring gunshots finally stopped abruptly after a long time. At least thousands of bullets had been used up. In the dust and ashes that were constantly flying up, there was the sound of the bullet chain running out of ammunition. Huaishir narrowed his eyes and poked his head out of the ruins to take a look. The keen perception brought by the mirror of nothingness allowed him to see through the dust and smoke, and he saw the heavy machine gun at the end of the long street. There were also bullet casings rolling on the ground, as well as the empty ammunition box next to it. As he expected, the heavy machine gun exuded a dark golden light that made people jealous, but the barrel had been burned red and twisted. It was obvious that it could no longer be used. He sucked in a breath of cold air. He did not expect the Shinua framework to have such a terrifying weapon of mass destruction. But then, in the slowly falling dust, he saw the slender figure coming out from behind the heavy machine gun. He froze on the spot. She was wearing an old-fashioned gray maid's overcoat and a white apron around her waist. Her long hair was tied up with a lace hair tie at the back of her head into a refreshing ponytail that hung down from her shoulders. Her smile was warm and gentle. Just looking at her made people feel that she was gentle and virtuous, and they wanted to take her home and be their wife. But for some reason, being stared at by that pair of quiet black eyes, they could not help but shiver. "Don't hide." Luo Xian waved in the direction of Huai Shi. "I see you. So you're the one who brought the relics from the border?" Huai Shi's face twitched. He turned around and looked at the red gloves without any bones left, as well as the broken relics from the border on the ground. His heart twitched in pain. "Ah, tens of millions of dollars worth of things, and you broke them all. Is that so?" Luo Xian casually raised her foot and stepped on the helmet next to her. Using the power of used steps, she casually crushed a rather luxurious relic into pieces. "Don't worry, there are actually a lot of these things. Junior brother, do you want them? I can give them all to you." In the dead silence, only the continuous roars and roars in the sky could be heard. Huai Shi sighed and walked out of his hiding place. Looking at her smiling face, the chill of death grew thicker and thicker, almost engulfing him. She stood in front of the only exit and set up a heavy machine gun. It was impossible for her to cook and wait for him to go home together. Besides, he did not dare to eat. Smelling the thick stench of blood that lingered in the air, his heart gradually sank to the bottom of the earth. "Sister Xian, what do you want to do?" "Of course, I want to do something that I have always wanted to do." Luo Xian thought for a moment and chuckled softly. "Let's call it indulgence. You see, it's like the legend of tearing up the textbook after the college entrance examination and then going to the bar all night to see the adult world. Although I'm not that naive, I still can't help but want to take this opportunity to do something that the adults didn't allow me to do before." Huai Shi's face twitched. "Yes, the adults really won't let the children set up a crane gun to sweep people for fun. So are you satisfied? The time to experience the adult world is over. Hurry up and pack up and go home." He wanted to say so very much, but in the end, he did not make a sound. If things could be so simple, he dared to eat the heavy machine gun. He could feel that behind Luo Xian's smile, there was a kind of ferocious killing intent that was becoming more and more unconcealable. Just like a beast, grinding teeth and sucking blood, impatient. Chapter 285. Don't look at me like this. In fact, I'm already 24 years old this year. In the silence, Luo Xian sighed regretfully. "I've never been in love, and I don't have a boyfriend. Except for the guys who eat eggs every day and train their muscles in vain, I don't even have a suitable peer. Occasionally, I meet a few people I get along with, and they disappear after chatting for a while. As a result, I've reached the age where I don't know if I can be called a young girl anymore. Occasionally, when I go out on the street, I'll be called auntie by ignorant children. Can you understand this feeling?" Looking at Huai Shi's stunned look, Luo Xian's smile became sly. "Although I sometimes look very old-fashioned, sometimes I want to be bold." Huai Shi nodded stiffly. So, I want to experience what the so-called love is. What kind of thing is it?" She seemed to be looking forward to it, and asked softly, "It's understandable that a woman pursues her own happiness, right?" Huai Shi was silent. At that moment, scarlet rain poured down endlessly from the sky. The realm of nothingness finally illuminated the surface of the quiet street, and he glimpsed the mountain of corpses and the sea of blood in front of the gate of victory. The corpses were almost piled up into a mountain, and the scarlet stream spread to Luo Xian's feet. Although that's true, he almost couldn't breathe. This happiness is a bit too exaggerated, isn't it? As the illusion shattered, the smile on Luo Xian's face also became fleeting. The empty shell belonging to a human was broken, revealing the boiling darkness that he had glimpsed in the mirror and the terrifying soul that was beyond the imagination of human beings. After the endless darkness and horror, The vicious eye that peeped at this place from a distance became clearer and clearer. The strange scene flashed by as if it was an illusion. Suddenly, Huaisha finally understood why he hadn't seen any other contestants here for so long. Most likely, other than himself, there would not be any other contestants who would come here. Until now, he finally clearly understood how terrifying and huge the abnormality that entangled Luo Xian was. Once it broke out, it would probably become a real hell, right? This sublimated soul, after absorbing an unknown amount of abyssal precipitation, was already on the verge of solidification. It almost turned into darkness. Is it worth it? Huaisha sighed, lowered his eyes, and slowly clenched the sword of virtue. After all, it's for love. Luo Xian looked at him quizzically. Didn't the book say that compared to love, breaking a leg or two doesn't matter? I thought someone like you, who risked your life for love, would understand me. This homophonic joke is not fun at all. Huaisha stared at her face and asked expressionlessly, So, Luo Xian, what do you want to do? How about I be your enemy? She smiled. Last time, our duel wasn't over yet, right? After witnessing your performance a few days ago, I can't wait. I really hope you can be rational, but you probably won't listen to what I'm saying, right? Huaisha shook his head and took a step forward. Facing the increasingly strong premonition of death, he summoned the sacrificial knife and pulled out the sword of virtue. Since today is a fan meeting, let me ask, have you bought the handshake coupon? Huh? Your Highness, are you going to give me intimate contact? I'm so happy. Luo Xian's smile became more and more cheerful. She casually picked up a dagger from ground. Be careful. It's my first time being a fanatic fan. If I act too aggressively, please. At that moment, her smiling face appeared in front of Huaisha, and the dagger stabbed out. Please forgive me. Bang! A shrill sound pierced the silence on the long street. Huaisha's sword was easily swung away by the dagger. But he took a step forward, his speed was very fast, and the sacrificial knife in his hand was swung horizontally. Luo Xian clenched her fist and hit his wrist. A roar burst out. Thunder. From the burst of lightning, Huaisha only remembered to turn his wrist, and he felt the sacrificial knife fly out of his hand. Then he was involuntarily lifted by the airwave and staggered back. What was even more unbelievable to him was Luo Xian's speed. It was far beyond his expectations. No, it should be said that it was not the same as before. It was at least 3 times faster. And what was even more incomprehensible to him was, in the collision and impact just now, what was reflected in the mirror of nothingness. Sacred mark. Unknowingly, Luo Xian, who was originally a white-board ascendant, had gained the sacred mark. And not only that, she had broken through to a level that made Huaisha dumbfounded. 3rd level. He looked at Luo Xian blankly. You huh? Sacred mark? Luo Xian looked at his expression as if he had seen a ghost. I thought you knew, but you don't know either? It seems that I was thinking too much. But it doesn't matter. I will continue to be your fan. Huaisha frowned. What do you mean? Her sacred mark was related to him? To be honest, I don't know what happened. Luo Xian tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then she said seriously, After watching your performance that day, a light flew from the sky. Before I could react, the sacred mark seemed to have appeared on my body, and it was accompanied by a lot of rituals and advancements. Does this kind of thing recognize a master? It's really strange. As she spoke, she opened her hands and showed Huaisha the miracle she had. Look, in the beginning, it was Little Red Riding Hood. After coincidentally killing a few wolf-type ascendants, it evolved into Sleeping Beauty. After sleeping for a long time, it found materials for evolution here and happened to meet a crow Tengu. It seems that it smoothly reached the 3rd stage. On her body, a blood-stained red dress faintly appeared, and behind her, a dark mirror slowly emerged. Finally, she bowed her head to His Royal Highness in front of her. Her hands slightly lifted the sides of her skirt as a salute, her posture elegant and reserved. And on her exposed white feet, there was a pair of exquisite crystal shoes that were like a dream. Cinderella, celestial genealogy, road to paradise. Third level, celestial Rilla. At that moment, Huaishir let out a long breath, trying to dispel the despair and powerlessness in his heart. But it was in vain. For the first time, he experienced this kind of helplessness and exhaustion. There was nothing he could do. If it was before, he could rely on his superior physique and various weapons to gain an advantage over Luo Xian. But now, Luo Xian's strength had risen to a height that he could never hope to reach. How could he win against Luo Xian's terrifying skills that she had completely inherited from Luo Xian? There was no way to fight at all. There was nothing he could do. Let's make a deal. Huaishir raised his hand tentatively. Can I surrender and lose half of it? Okay. Luo Xian smiled and nodded, but the ending will be from being torn into thousands of pieces to being torn into thousands of pieces. Does it make a difference to you? Huaishir sighed. After feeling the ferocious killing intent and darkness erupting from her body like a volcano, he gave up the last hope. Don't give up, Your Royal Highness. This is the last battle. Luo Xian comforted him. As an idol, at least before you die, you have to satisfy the only wish of your fans, right? Are you looking forward to my death? Huaishir took a step back and grinned. I'll try. Bang! His heels stepped on the stairs, causing a crack to appear. Huaishir rushed forward, charging straight towards Luo Xian, who was right in front of him. He raised the spear of compassion, thrusting it straight out. Luo Xian's smile did not change. She just slightly tilted her head. But then a roar burst out. Huaishir's sleeves were torn, and in this full swing at that moment, it seemed that several figures rose from his body. The axe of anger swept, the sword of virtue pierced, and the spear shook, suddenly curved from the refreshing fragrance of flowers, chasing Luo Xian's face. The sharp notes overlapped, evolving into a soul-shaking chord. In the loud sound of metal rubbing, Luo Xian's eyes finally showed a trace of seriousness. She stamped her feet, picked up a long sword from the ground, and separated her hands. The two long and short swords collided together, and then separated again to both sides, but burst out a crisp sound of ripping cords. In a flash, Huaishir's 3 attacks at the same time were blocked. They were separated one by one. The short sword stabbed out, aiming straight at Huaishir's chest. But then, in the shadow behind her, the ghost with the red gloves appeared again, holding the sacrificial knife in his hand upside down, aiming at her back. Bang! The gloomy magic mirror emerged from Luo Xian's side, like a shield, blocking this fatal blow. In an instant, the two crossed each other, and Huaishir's chest appeared a tragic crack, blood gushing out. Luo Xian was unscathed. But then, Huaishir ignored the crack in his chest, turned around abruptly, and chopped at Luo Xian's back with the deadly axe blade. It cut through the illusion. As the mirror shattered, Luo Xian appeared 10 steps away, looking at him with interest. There was no need for her to explain. Huaishir suddenly understood. Sleeping Beauty? Luo Xian tilted her head, looked at the towering mirror beside her, and suddenly asked, Mirror, mirror, who is the most beautiful woman in the world? A face appeared in the magic mirror and said flatteringly, Of course it's you, Your Highness. It seemed to be some kind of blessing. In an instant, the waves of origin substance on Luo Xian's body rose steadily, until finally it almost formed a grayish-black flame, contrasting with her red clothes, which were as red as blood. No, it should be dyed red by the blood of ferocious beasts, right? Huaishir sucked in a breath of cold air, stretched out his hand, and pressed on the tree stump next to him. Sorry, brother, let me absorb a little more. A huge amount of vitality flowed from the underground network of roots. The wound on Huaishir's chest closed, and the cracks in his bones and the strain on his muscles disappeared instantly. The bulging capillaries on his face also revealed a dark green color. The support of Brother Tree and Little Tree was enough. Under the transformation of the sacred mark, Huaishir ignored the gradual fibrosis of his internal blood vessels and poured an endless stream of blood qi into the mirror of nothingness, causing the light in his eyes to become brighter and brighter, as if a light bulb had been inserted. Gradually, it became dazzling. The mirror of nothingness finally reflected Luo Xian's true appearance completely. Chapter 286. No matter what, isn't this too much? Huaisher sucked in a cold breath. Even though he was prepared, he still couldn't believe his eyes. In the bubble reflected by the mirror of void, Luo Xian's body was already covered in cracks. She looked like a piece of porcelain that had been smashed and then pieced back together. Even though her skin was white and crystalline, it was still unable to seal off the darkness origin substance that flowed out of her body. It was just like a volcano. Endless darkness rose from within, and illusory smoke rose into the sky. It was as if a crack leading to another world had been torn open. Behind the endless darkness, a cruel eye covered with blood vessels stared at her back, and its gaze was filled with the virtue and madness of the abyss. If it weren't for the celestial genealogy's high adaptability to the abyss, she would have been solidified long ago. Was this the reason why the road to paradise chose her? No. Now, what was the difference between this terrifying corrosion and the corrosion after solidification? Her soul seemed to have been pieced together from the beginning. It was like a fruit planted from the soil of the abyss. Even though it was sweet and pleasant, it exuded a ferocious aura that didn't belong to human beings. She was inhuman in nature. Now, she was just peeling off the human shell little by little and returning to the group of monsters. Under the gaze of the strange eye, she gradually fell into the abyss. She was only a step away. How did you survive until now? Huaisher felt fear and puzzlement from the bottom of his heart. This kind of life, which seemed to be haunted by evil spirits from birth and was destined to be unbreakable, how could it last until today? Is it strange? Luo Xian replied with a smile. Of course, it's because of love. A lie. Huaisher was silent for a long time. He couldn't help but sigh and slowly shook his head. Sister Xian, have you really felt the so-called love before? Luo Xian didn't answer. It was just that her smile became colder and colder. She was like a hungry wolf grandmother whose disguise was seen through. She could no longer smile kindly. Not everyone is as lucky as you. Why sure? She finally stopped laughing. She just quietly stared at the youth in front of her, separated by the red rain falling from the sky. Even if it's just a hell full of torture for someone like me, it's still like heaven. I'm so happy to hear that. Huaisher opened his mouth and spat out a scorching breath, tearing apart the rain of blood in front of him. I feel like I'm completely different now. Yes, he was completely different. In the bursting dark green flames, countless capillaries burst open on Huaisher's face like a spiderweb. Blood dripped from his body, and countless flowers and plants grew from the broken asphalt road. Mushrooms grew from the spreading thin blood. Amidst the dense blood aura, countless invisible viruses spread out along with the black fog of fear. Under the crazy extraction, without thinking of the consequences, Huaisher and the vitality network in the roots under his feet were almost completely connected. The first time he entered such a deep state was when he broke through from the first level and reshaped his body. But now he was hovering on the border between human and plant. He didn't know if there would be a day when he would return to human form if he completely turned into wood. Perhaps even a Shin UF framework couldn't be used, and he would be imprisoned forever in the roots of Yamatai City's plants. It was almost like a gamble. From the mirror of nothingness, he gained strength. Under the broken boots, Huaisher's toes and fingers had already appeared with wood markings. Strands of vine branches and leaves grew out of his long hair. But the moment he took a step, his speed was beyond the past. He was almost on par with the former Van Helsing. Cheetah gallop! From the roar and rumble, Huaisher whistled through the air. He raised a knife and axe in his hands and chopped down. Finally, he forced Luo Xian to take a step back. Even if it was only one step, Huaisher's heart surged with ecstasy. Side sweeping ground, the angry axe suddenly elongated. As Huaisher turned around, the invisible blade of the axe chopped towards Luo Xian's lower body. It was blocked by the long sword in her hand, and sparks flew. Tornado destroys the parking lot. In an instant, the knife, axe, sword, and spear in Huaisher's hands kept changing. At the critical moment, a steel storm was set off and chopped towards Luo Xian in front of him. Then, in front of the two long and short swords that opened and closed at will, they were blocked one by one. Luo Xian took a step forward and elbowed. In the roar, the air burst out. Huaisher instantly took a dozen steps back. But then, his whole body flew up like a spring compressed to the limit. Crow takes a plane. Bang! The chopping that relied on the whole body's strength and accumulated momentum for a long time was easily guided to one side by Luo Xian. It deviated from its original target and cut a deep mark on the road. Huaisher flipped in the air and blocked Luo Xian's fierce attack in a sorry state before landing on the ground. There's no need to use those random names as a cover, right? She stepped forward with a faint smile and pressed on step by step. If it's just this over-limit state, I learned it 7 years ago. This is called creativity. Huaisher turned back and spat out a mouthful of blood foam with many grass seeds. Under the broken wooden skin, the muscles of his arms were violently pulsating. His joints rubbed against each other and burst out thunder. It was as if his whole body had been ignited. Over-limit state. It was the first time Huaisher had heard of this name. This power came from the guidance of the mirror of nothingness. But the root of it was just a high-level application of the drummer in Yu's steps. He was not surprised that Luo Xian could see through it. After extracting the blood of several Huaisher, he did not see any possibility of winning from the reflection of the mirror of nothingness. It was better to say that this possibility did not exist in the first place. A stage 3 against a stage 2 should be a one-sided beating. If the previous Huaisher could use his own ability, foundation, many trump cards, and even his own talent to make up for this flaw, then in front of an even greater talent, there was no doubt that his own talent would be like showing off in front of an expert. His opponent was Luo Xian. The reason he could be alive and kicking until now was entirely because Luo Xian had shown mercy and he had relied on chatting to buy time. After all, apart from her terrifying physical fitness and killing skills, she had not used the talent ability of the Sacred Mark. This was an opponent he had absolutely no chance of winning against. If he could still retain the terrifying power of the former Angel of Power, he could still have a good chance of winning. But where would he get this kind of Pokemon from? However, there was still a way to contend. In the end, Yu's steps and drummer were just a partial application of power. What if this application covered the whole body? If he let his whole body enter that kind of explosive state, wouldn't he be able to gain power like when he used to take drugs as a ghost? Although the price was a strong burden and destruction on his body, there was no need to worry about this with Hilgos's incredible HP recovery speed. At worst, it would be difficult to control the degree of erosion of the Sacred Mark, and he would become a Tran again. At this moment, Huaisher had completely forgotten the option of pulling out his sword and cutting his own throat to leave safely. He didn't want to escape, and he couldn't escape. If he retreated from here, Luo Xian's erosion would definitely completely enter an uncontrollable range. At that time, no matter what he did, there would be no saving him. He just wanted to buy time. It would be best if he could delay until the battle in the sky was over, and there was a big shot from Dongxia who could reach out and help him. Buying time? I don't care. Luo Xian saw through his plan and still smiled. Or rather, I'm flattered that you're willing to play with me for a while. A real idol can't say no to their fans. Isn't this what you taught me? While twitching in pain, he squeezed out a hearty smile, clenched his sword again, and rushed toward the invincible enemy in front of him. The soles of his feet sank deeply into the broken road. It was as if he was wading through a quagmire. Every step he took was difficult. Even the air had turned into a viscous liquid, entangling his limbs. However, when he stomped his feet, a loud sound would be heard from the silent earth. Blood would splatter out from his arms, evaporating into blazing blood energy in the air. The mountain ghost roared. The dark green light rose from the vitality network under his feet and gathered in his body, supporting the continuous squandering. The sword and the axe fell, and the blade was swung. The long and short swords in Luo Xian's hands suddenly stagnated. Under the brutal suppression of Huaisher, they were no longer as light as before. They were evenly matched. Sure enough, my father was right. During the violent collision of the sword and the blade, Luo Xian looked at the cold and ferocious face in front of her and nodded approvingly. Although a person like you is destined to have no talent in creation, you may have other talents in application. Bang! The playing method of the sword and the blade changed again. It extended from the changes in the melody of the G string to fanaticism. The solemn meaning burst out from the heavy knocks of fate. The sword of virtue slashed horizontally and vertically. Together with the axe of wrath, they were swung out in a crisscross manner. From the burning without regard for his own safety, Huaisher stepped forward step by step, wielding the power beyond the limit. He advanced to a high speed that was difficult to reach in the past, and the iron light shone. Countless vines and thorns grew out from the cracks of the road under their feet all the time. But then, under the trampling of the crystal shoes, they silently withered into ashes. The color of blood covered the two swords from the red dress. The instant explosion carried a power that was enough to crush Huaisher to pieces, immune to poison, not afraid of ashes, and even had an explosive power that was enough to seriously injure Huaisher in an instant. The road of paradise seemed to be a natural restraint of Huaisher. Even Huaisher could feel that there was something more dangerous hidden behind Luo Xian's smile. Unexpectedly, Huaisher took a step back and dodged a short sword that suddenly changed direction and slashed in front of Huaisher's throat. Seizing the only gap, he attacked fiercely and suppressed Luo Xian again. Then he dodged the blade that Luo Xian stabbed again. It was as if he had expected it. In Luo Xian's hands, every attack and plot hidden in the change of moves were seen through. He was so pure and sophisticated that he was not like the young man in her memory. Is it because of rapid progress? Or was there another reason? Who knows? Maybe I'm a genius. Huaisher looked at the dozens of possibilities reflected, interpreted, and predicted in the mirror of nothingness and said shamelessly. Chapter 287. If Elder Luo were here, he might praise Huaisher for his shamelessness. He reminded Elder Luo of himself when he was young. But for Luo Xian, it didn't matter whether there was another reason or whether Huaisher was a real genius. It didn't make any difference. On the contrary, she became even more excited. In this case, I don't need to go easy on you, right? The coldness brought by Luo Xian's smile suddenly rushed to the back of Huaisher's head. The premonition of death spread wildly from his skull. In a moment of trance, Huaisher's consciousness was almost subdued by the horrible killing intent. Then, she suddenly came in front of Huaisher. Holding the dagger upside down, she stabbed toward Huaisher's face. That movement was too gentle and smooth, so much so that it made people think that it was a gentle caress. But in reality, within that smooth movement, there was unmistakable killing intent. Swift and fast, even with the prediction of the mirror of nothingness, Huaisher's face was almost scratched by this move. It was too fast. Her speed was so fast that he couldn't predict it. The moment the prediction came to his mind, she was already in front of him. Bang! The blade of the sword was parried. She didn't use any skills. She used the most violent way. Strength against strength. Blazing blood energy rose from Huaisher's left arm. Wild power surged from his body, bringing him a burning pain and power that was close to thunder. Huaisher roared, stepped forward, and forced Luo Xian to take a step back again. Luo Xian raised her eyebrows. She didn't expect that the combination of the Mountain Ghost Divine Mark and the Ultra State could reach such an incredible level. The blade of the axe fell and violently set off a hurricane, tearing the ground under his feet. The cracks stretched straight forward dozens of meters in an instant, all the way to Luo Xian's feet. Using this power extravagantly, Huaisher explored the upper limit of what he could accept. In an instant, he broke through the air. Muscles had their limits. Even if it was said that the power used by each person was only 1% of the power of their muscles, as long as the restraint was broken, they could erupt to a level that even they were afraid of. But there was still a limit. The Mountain Ghost Sacred Marks level determined the existence of this upper limit. However, There was no such thing as a limit to origin substance itself. Ignoring each person's unique characteristics, the transformations between ranks, and the total amount of origin substance. Origin substance was a power that was born from one's soul and consciousness, which violated the very foundations of physics and thermodynamics. It was able to reach the level of subverting the three great seals of the present realm. As long as there were enough terrifying numbers, it was not impossible for the Creator to rewrite the world. This was where the drummer in Yu's steps had broken through. Out of the thousands of origin substances in the world, it was one of the most closely connected to the physical body. Through the combination of pure skill and origin substance, it could help a person break through the limits of their physical strength and unleash destructive power that far exceeded their own. By endlessly absorbing the vitality of the surroundings, Huaishir was able to convert a large amount of blood energy into blood energy, which was endlessly poured into the mirror of nothingness. Using this cheat-like power, she was able to master this technique a few years earlier than she would have been able to. At this moment, he could sense that as the origin substance continued to deplete, his own strength continued to increase. Step by step, he was destroying this damaged shell of a body. He was going to die. With the help of the mirror of nothingness, he was stingily and fully utilizing every tendon, every bone, and every joint. In the end, he was going to completely collapse. He was going to precisely die. Under this crazy operation, he could sense his lifespan rapidly decreasing, as if he was squandering his entire life's worth of strength in these short 10 minutes. No, was there still 10 minutes left? How much time did he have left? 10 minutes? 5 minutes? Or 3 minutes? Before this false life was squandered away, how long would he be able to enjoy this kind of power that surpassed his limits? He had long since tossed this to the back of his mind. Come! The virtuous sword and the sacrificial blade rubbed against each other. Sparks flew, illuminating the mountain ghost's broken smile. A blazing light shot out from the crack in the youth's chest. He was burning, giving a performance to his fans. Time waits for no one, he muttered softly. Cherish this final meeting. The blade slashed down. Bang! In the roar, Luo Xian raised her arms. The long and short swords covered with cracks slashed out. Dozens of silver-white steel lights burned in the air. The broken arcs seemed to be engraved in the air. They tore through the hurricane and collided with the steel in Huaishir's hands. Sparks flew. The long sword shattered. Huaishir stepped on the sword and attacked fiercely. But Luo Xian took a step back, as if she had predicted this. As she stepped on the sword, an iron hammer flew from the ground and fell into her hand. As she swung it, it drew an arc in the air and collided with the blade of the axe again. A dazzling light flashed and disappeared. If I knew you were so strong, I wouldn't have waited so long. Luo Xian's expression became more and more cheerful. From the broken soul, the precipitate of the abyss danced wildly. It turned into pitch black and gushed out, almost swallowing Huaishir. The killing intent was bone-piercing. Do you know? From the collision of the sword and the blade, she stared at the youth in front of her and suddenly said, Father, he wanted you to kill me. There are always people who have such unrealistic expectations of me. Huaishir slashed and retorted expressionlessly. From the beginning, I seem to have said that I didn't learn these things to kill anyone. What a joke. The collision of the metal burst out a sharp sound, but it couldn't suppress Luo Xian's laughter. Is there someone who learns how to kill for the world's peace? Maybe you don't want to believe. Huaishir couldn't help but sigh. I was just free at that time. I really like the way you say one thing and mean another. It's like you're saying sweet words. You can always deceive those girls who haven't seen it. In your plan, does it include me? Luo Xian chuckled and stepped forward, the weapons in her hands constantly changing with her footsteps. She was even empty-handed. Thunder, thunderclap, heaven's fall, earth's sinkhole. She fiercely suppressed Huaishir. One punch. The axe in Huaishir's hand flew out and flew into the air. Before it landed, it dissipated and condensed again in Huaishir's hand, blocking the dagger she picked up from the ground. It almost pierced through the thick back of the axe, and the sharp edge was only a line away from Huaishi's pupils. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the cold light in front of him. Without hesitation, "Yes, that's the look in your eyes." Luo Xian's voice came from his ear, like a whisper. With the step of the crystal shoe, she appeared behind Huaishi in a flash and whispered in his ear, "From the first time I saw you, I felt that we were the same person. We lived until now by killing something. Huaishi, if you want to live, you can only kill more." She smiled and stared at the side of the same kind, and told him, "We are all the same. Do you also have long magic hair?" Huaishi asked back, turned around, and slashed the sacrificial knife at her. "Do you have magic hands?" The blade of the axe slashed down. "Will there be any small animals that will talk to you?" The long spear swept across. "Will there be a little sister who will help you solve your problems like she helped me?" Boom! The angry blade pierced through the air, and the straight wind left a deep mark at the end of the distant street. Huaishi gasped, letting the blood fall from his face. He stared at Luo Xian, who had retreated in the distance, and told her word by word, "We are not the same. I am Huaishi, male, 17 years old, a high school student in Dongxia, a professional cellist, an action member of the astronomy club, the Prince of Paradise, a disaster musician, a trainee exorcist, a lot of titles." Huaishi raised his head and told her, "I have a dream. I want to protect my family. I want to live on with my own efforts and make a name for myself. I want to live a respectable life. When I'm 70 or 80 years old, I want to die happily with my wife, children, and grandchildren. It would be best if I could enter the card pool of some bullsh asterisk tea game and let people pay for me. I want to live. I want to live better. I want more people to be like me." So, Huaishi stepped forward, slashed, and declared to Luo Xian, "I am different from you." He used all his strength, stepped on the wind, and crushed the ground under his feet. He chased after Luo Xian's changing shadow and slashed the long sword, short knife, and axe in his hand with all his strength. This was a chord that gave his all. This was a peak that had yet to be reached. The burning source substance attached to the edge of the iron and burst out with a brilliance that could not be looked directly at. It was as if it was breathing with the iron. The power of the hand of confinement was exerted on every inch of the iron, causing the iron to burst out with a roar that echoed Huaishi. Luo Xian retreated and retreated again. At that moment, Huaishi widened his eyes in disbelief. In the reflection of the mirror of nothingness, he could not see her. He could only see that she was flying between the burning iron, circling, rising, and falling. She was unbelievably light. When she landed from the air, the tip of her feet touched the ground lightly, and her hands spread out gracefully. She was unharmed from the attack of the Xiang dragon. That was not an unexpected skill. She did not even use the speed that was superior to Huaishi's. Rather, it was more like a natural reaction, as if she was responding to a dance partner. She took light steps, maintaining the most reserved distance from the passionate pursuer, but also giving him a chance to get close to her. Huaishi looked at her in shock. He could not believe it, and almost ignored the pain that came from his limbs. Luo Xian tilted her head and looked at him with a mischievous smile. "Ballet, haven't you seen it before?" She tiptoed again and showed Huaishi the basic movements perfectly. Her eyes were drifting and focused. "The song you chose to play just now, I've heard it before. It's Sheng Sang Swan, right?" Huaishi was silent. He did not know how to respond. His rhythm had been completely seen through by her. No, maybe from the beginning, she did not take it seriously, as if she was just playing with him. "I like ballet very much," Luo Xian said seriously. "Unfortunately, I only learned it for 2 days before my teacher chased me away. But before that, I learned Swan Lake." With a gentle smile on her face, she leaped from the pool of blood and spun around in a soundless rhythm. She turned around, stretched her slender legs and arms, and spun around lightly. It was as if she was dancing to a soundless melody. It was so beautiful. Finally, she turned around and looked at Huaishi. She asked softly, "How is it?" "It's beautiful." Huaishi nodded. "It's really as beautiful as a swan." That's right. She was like a swan dancing by a blood-red lake. It was a frightening color and a frightening scene, but with her around, everything seemed to become beautiful. Red Swan. It's not just ballet. I've also learned how to paint, sing, and even the violin. Luo Xian suddenly said, I've worked hard to learn, even if I didn't learn well. Watching movies, listening to music, cooking, knitting sweaters, helping the elderly and children, donating to people in need, chasing stars, and falling in love. I've tried almost everything that can make people happy. She looked at the young man in front of her. Her smile had disappeared. But I've never experienced the kind of happiness you're talking about. Why is that, Huai Shi? She took a step forward and solemnly stared into Huai Shi's eyes. How can I be as happy as you? Yes, please tell me. What should I do to become happy? Please tell me, she said. No matter what you want, I can give it to you. Almost as if she was begging, she looked into Huai Shi's eyes expectantly and begged for his mercy. Please tell me. Huai Shi was silent. He looked at her pitifully, at her soul that was riddled with holes, and at the darkness that had swallowed her. Her lips opened, but she couldn't say anything. She could only remain silent. So, Luo Xian lowered her eyes in understanding, as if she had expected it. You can't help it, right? Since she was born, she had been looking forward to being able to experience the things that others talked about. The happiness that was mentioned in the stories before school, the love that was mentioned in fairy tales, and the happiness that existed at the end of every story. But what was happiness? What was happiness? What was the so-called love? These things are all lies, right? As if she had finally understood, Luo Xian murmured in realization. Those were all lies. They were all lies. It was a lie that everyone had used to deceive her. Those were treasures that only others could show off to themselves, but she had nothing. After a long silence, Huai Shi didn't dare to look into her eyes. He sighed helplessly. I'm sorry. Is that so? Luo Xian's eyes gradually turned cold. There was no enthusiasm and expectation. Gradually, they became as empty as an abyss. Why don't you leave? Huai Shi, isn't the game over? She asked indifferently. You have never come here for the ranking. If you want to, you can leave here any time, right? Why do you want to stay and play a game with a crazy woman? I wanted to run, but I didn't. Later, I didn't want to run anymore. Huai Shi said, I want to save you. Luo Xian was stunned. In the silence, as if she had heard a great joke, she couldn't help but smile. Her heart shook, and she pulled her vocal cords to let out a mocking and mischievous laugh. She laughed loudly. So that's how it is? She seemed to finally understand what he had been trying to do in vain. But because of this, she felt even more incredulous. She felt even more absurd. You really are His Royal Highness, Huai Shi, she whispered softly. She raised her eyes and looked at the youth in front of her. She revealed a sinister and deathly stillness that was like the essence of the abyss. Countless drops of blood were turbulent because of the sound of thunder in the distance. The silence on the broken street was torn apart. The piles of corpses fell apart under the impact. The curtain of blood rain was shaken and rolled in all directions. A sharp shadow emerged from the end of the blood rain. It whistled and condensed its own form from nothingness. It came under the trampling of the crystal shoes. Under the light of the dark green candlelight, the withered and shriveled huge pumpkin was soaked in blood. Under the pull of the skeleton horse, the 6 huge wheels crushed the earth, bursting with thunder. Under Cinderella's prayer, the pumpkin carriage from the nightmare reappeared in this hell, bringing with it a chilling aura. Then please dance with me, His Royal Highness. Luo Xian stretched out her hand and stroked the skeleton horse's face. She turned back and invited Huai Shi in the distance, just like you standing on the stage at that time, shining as if you could save everyone. Please dance with me. So, she boarded the carriage of death and cast a final cold glance at Huai Shi. But, I love you deeply. So, the skeleton horse neighed. There was a blood-colored flame rising above the carriage, forming a substantial fierceness and violence. Regardless of its own power and madness, the miracle of the road of paradise was awakened. It spat out the breath of death at Huai Shi ferociously. The love of the abyss was entrusted to it. In the silence, Huai Shi sighed, pulled out the sword of virtue, and slashed. The iron hooves trampled on the broken road. The white horse returned from the void again and neighed. When it saw Cinderella in the carriage in the distance, it couldn't help but take a step back and snorted at Huaisher unhappily. It stared at Huaisher with a pair of eyes. "Why do you always provoke such troublesome opponents?" "Yeah." Huaisher scratched his head. "Why do I always encounter such troublesome enemies?" After thinking about it, there seemed to be only one reason. Probably this world was not good to him. But compared to others, wasn't he lucky? He hadn't fallen yet. He hadn't ushered in the suffering, torture, and devastation that he couldn't bear. He hadn't been taken away by unreasonable and sudden death, and he hadn't been obliterated by this world. He was still alive, could still get up, and could still continue to move forward. So what excuse could he have to complain? Now, the bitter water had been poured out, and he hadn't died yet. So, he couldn't give up here. "I'm going to perform my duties as a prince." Huaisher looked at the white horse and asked with a smile, "Can you do me a favor?" The white horse stared at him, not knowing whether it was angry or depressed. Soon it snorted. After snorting twice, it proudly puffed out its chest, indicating that he should hurry up and not dawdle. It was naturally very handsome. Huaisher grinned, got on the horse, and looked at the figure in the darkness on the carriage. "Are you ready, Your Highness?" The Prince of Paradise held the reins and sword in his hand and softly announced, "I'm going." In front of the blood-colored carriage, the two skeleton war horses neighed unhappily and roared silently. In the darkness on the carriage, there seemed to be a happy smile. "Only you can bring me such joy, Huaisher." Luo Xian raised her hand, and a painful flame appeared in the ashes, covering the entire carriage. The power of the road of paradise traveled here and showed in her hand, placing a huge force on this chariot. She stared at Huaisher's face, waiting for his final performance, the last trace of joy that she could seek. "Come, Your Highness, please bring me my last happiness." Chapter 288. In the dead silence, everything seemed to be frozen. The rain of blood that fell from the sky was infected by the frost that soared into the sky. It stopped in the cold wind, and the world fell into a solemn silence. Only the roars and loud noises from the sky could be heard. When the dazzling flash of light flashed from the sky, a sharp and ear-piercing collision sound came from the crack in the blood-red sky. The world was trembling violently before this mighty force that came out of nowhere. Then, the dark cloud shattered, and endless light spewed out from the sky. Countless flesh and blood grew like trees, and the hands of the premature child struggled to grab the crack in the sky. It was as if it couldn't wait to give birth. But was it the cry of joy of birth, or the cry of pain and sorrow of death? No one could say for sure whether the mournful cry was filled with joy and despair. Soon after, a huge broken body fell from the sky, burning and crushing the collapsed clouds, emitting a radiance of aging and despair. It was the sun. The sun was falling, because the eternal night was coming. "Come, Luo Xian." Huaisher clenched the hilt of his sword and whispered softly, "I will bet everything I have." At that moment, the white horse bathed in blood followed the prince's roar and stomped its iron hooves. It followed the last light and charged towards the enemy. The sword was raised, leading the last light to cut the darkness in front of it. He turned his back to the mournful sun and moved forward. His figure seemed to be melting in the brilliant and mournful sun, like the prince, shining. Countless afterlights that fell on the ground seemed to be disturbed by the horse's movement. They flew up like fireflies, followed the light, flew into the sky, and disappeared into the darkness. "It's so dazzling, Prince." Luo Xian stared at the burning light, not knowing whether it was longing or anger. She just smiled and whispered softly, "Please save me, Your Highness." The darkness roared. From the rolling darkness, the ferocious pumpkin carriage shook violently and roared forward. The rain of blood rolled up against gravity and flew towards the sky. The mournful red wriggled and embellished the spreading darkness. The power overflowing from Luo Xian's shattered soul erupted and finally broke through the invisible barrier. They retracted the fog of pain that engulfed everything and condensed into a tangible form. Spreading its wings, its iron-like scales spread open, reflecting the last rays of the scorching sun. It roared towards the sky, tyrannically suppressing all the noise in this furious cry. This was the despair and pain accumulated from 24 years of waiting, the disaster and miracle born from the soul from the abyss. Just a brief glimpse of it was enough to cause countless Chaos Abyss groups to submit to its terrifying might. Even the embryo of disaster that was still in the process of being born was enough to terrify all spectators. That was a dragon, the dark demonic dragon. At this moment, it wasn't just the audience in front of their screens. Even Harkin's eyelids couldn't help but twitch wildly. Just his soul alone can cause a qualitative change in a mystic dragon. Isn't this talent a little too exaggerated? The Harkin scratched his face in frustration. For the first time, he felt that his job as a commentator wasn't easy. He couldn't help but sigh when he turned around to look at Baizé. Do you think he can win? Baizé turned around to look at him, as if she was looking at an idiot. Do you even need to ask? She concluded regretfully, he'll definitely lose. As a divine beast who could directly observe the countless branches of history, she had already seen the only inevitable result among the hundreds of thousands of different branches. It was an ending that no amount of luck or wisdom could change. Baizé sighed softly as if she was admiring Roland. He's dead for sure. At this moment, as the carriage rumbled forward, the demonic dragon's shadow flapped its wings, sweeping up a hurricane and a rain of blood. It destroyed the ground, dark clouds, sky, and all other insignificant dust in front of it. Carrying this heavy love for the Chaos Abyss, it opened its mouth and poured its heart out to the prince in front of it. It roared without restraint. Terrifying waves of origin substance gathered in the dragon's throat. Pain and despair rubbed against each other, creating dazzling sparks. Immediately after, as the roar shook the heavens and earth, white flames appeared from the depths of the darkness. They swept forward like a flood, swallowing up the last radiance of the setting sun. The dragon's flames burned brightly and rushed forward. At that moment, the white horse leapt into the air. It neighed and galloped in the wind, its long mane fluttering like a flag. Don't walk gently into the good night. Huaishur gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, but a poem from the Chaos Abyss suddenly appeared in his mind. Old age should burn and roar at sunset. Roar, roar, denounce the retreat of the light. Denounce the disappearance of the light. At that moment, the sword of virtue vibrated slightly. As Huaishur silently chanted, it burst forth with a roar of steel. The mountain ghost's sacred mark suddenly extended into thousands of strands, sinking into the countless ancient inscriptions on the inside of the sword hilt. The surging vitality transformed into a pure glow, adhering to the blade. It was like a glimmer of hope at dawn. With all my soul dedicated to this sword, virtue will exist with our legend, as countless people chanted solemnly in a trance. Huaishur raised his arm, revealing the brilliant light on the blade in front of the self-destructive dragon's flames. Compared to the generosity and solemnity of the past, what appeared now was just a tiny thread. But it burned stubbornly. Even if the dragon's flames swept over, it still did not extinguish. There was no difference between great and small virtue, and there was no difference between many and lonely virtue. Even if it could not change any of the pain and despair in reality, it was still enough to reflect the existence of hope. Just existing here was enough to illuminate the long road ahead. Here, it announced the arrival of dawn. Huaishur roared and slashed down the blade. The vast and long night ends here. Compared to the previous world-shaking torrent, Huaishur's hand only had a thread of remnant light. But even if it was just a thread of remnant light, as the blade slashed down, it burst forth with a tearing dragon's roar. The light that cut through the darkness flashed and disappeared. But the endless dragon's flames were like a flood, parting to the sides under the slash of the blade. The raging sea was opened up under the solemn and mighty blade. The sea was divided. Huaisha moved forward, the hot knife through butter. The demon dragon roared angrily, roaring at Huaisha. But the white horse raised its iron hooves and trampled on its face, crushing the pitch-black scales. Ignoring the remaining flames, the white horse broke through the demon dragon's illusion and forced its way into the endless deep darkness. Huaisha raised the blade again and launched an irresistible attack at the carriage in front of him. The crown of paradise appeared on top of his head. The light tore through the squirming darkness and stung the reflected eye in the distant space. It announced the arrival of the prince. The darkness hissed and collided with the last remnant light. An ear-piercing screech erupted. Countless blood rain splashed in all directions. As the thread of light moved forward, and forward, Huaisha's roar penetrated into the depths of the darkness. "I'm coming to save you, Luo Xian." On the burning white horse, the mountain ghost roared. He exerted all his strength to break through the last barrier and stab the blade at Luo Xian in the darkness. The lonely princess raised her eyes, which were bloodshot and ferocious. In the next moment, the white horse and the chariot passed by each other. In the dead silence, there was only the sound of falling apart. The outcome had been decided. As the blood rain splashed again, it fell on the ground like tears. The galloping chariot came to an abrupt stop. What a pity, Huaisha! In the carriage, the princess in the darkness looked back with disappointment. You can't save anyone. A line of blood dripped from a blade in her hand. In the quiet street, the running white horse suddenly staggered, took 2 steps forward with difficulty, and knelt on the ground powerlessly, raising a cloud of dust. The color of blood spread out from its body. It turned its head with difficulty and gently licked the prince's broken face with praise and pity. "Don't blame yourself, Your Highness. At least you fought to the last moment." Its figure gradually became illusory and dissipated silently. Huaisha fell in the dust, and a pool of blood spread out from under him. The sound of shattering sounded from the depths of his body, one after another, heralding the arrival of death. He lost. Is it over like this? Luo Xian quietly stared at the back for a long, long time, until the last hope in her lowered eyes dissipated. The soul that was on the verge of its limit made a cracking sound. The endless darkness surged and finally opened a crack that led to somewhere. Those faint calls sounded again, as if they were whispering in his ears. It was so clear. In the surging darkness, blurry phantoms slowly emerged from it, respectfully prostrating on the ground, quietly waiting for her return. "Did you come and pick me up?" Luo Xian asked softly. Then, a slender figure rose from the crack of nothingness. A cold and tyrannical majesty showed a crack from the distant abyss. It reached out its palm to her, with salvation and grace from the abyss. It waited for her response. It led her to the paradise that truly belonged to her. This was the reunion after a long separation, the return after 24 years. "Wait a minute," a discordant voice sounded from the warm reunion of the abyss, ruining the atmosphere. "It's not over yet." The embarrassed young man who fell in the blood made a sound. He reached out to Luo Xian with difficulty and told her, "I'm still alive." Luo Xian turned her head and saw him stiffly propping up his body, falling to the ground again, climbing up again, crawling forward like a dog. He approached her inch by inch. "Not dead yet," she whispered softly, and then fell into confusion. No, he should have died long ago, right? She couldn't hear the rhythm of his steps, nor the low sound of his heartbeat. But as the pair of empty eyes looked up, the broken body propped up its arms and climbed up from the ground again almost inconceivably. She didn't have the slightest doubt about her ability. As early as the moment they passed each other, Huaisha should have died. But what was it that was left there? Was it a stubborn obsession? A consciousness that hadn't dissipated? Or a broken soul? No matter what it was very unpleasant. He was like a shameless sticky candy sticking to her body. After facing so many rejections and setbacks, he still kept pestering her. Why was he so shameless? Wait a minute, Huaisha murmured hollowly. I'm coming soon. Why was he still alive? Even Huaisha himself didn't know. He forgot who he was, where he was, and even what he was doing. He just tried very hard to live, trying to get up from the ground, propping up his numb body, and stumbling forward just like he had done countless times in the past. But he couldn't find where his target was. He didn't even know if what he was doing had any meaning. For some reason, in a trance, he seemed to hear a familiar voice. When the time comes, will you still treat monsters like us as equals? Why sure? Will you save innocent people? The distant voice asked softly, with pity and expectation, eager for his answer. Will you still uphold justice and extend a helping hand to those who ask for help like you? Even if the world was not good to you. Even if many times you couldn't do anything about it and found that you couldn't do anything. Even if everything you did was in vain. Why sure? Will you still become a hero? That's of course. Why sure roared with all his strength, stirring up his broken lungs, and used all his strength to answer the voice. He endured the pain that made him want to cry, and took a step forward awkwardly. Another step. Don't be afraid, Luo Xian. I'm coming. He reached out to the darkness, wanting to touch the distant shadow. As if abandoned by the whole world, she stood alone in the deepest part of the darkness. Her dark pupils reflected the appearance of hell, silent without any ripples. She was so lonely as if she was about to leave the world. Huaisha opened his mouth and wanted to speak, but he couldn't make a sound. He had a lot to say to Luo Xian, but he couldn't say it. He wanted to tell her, don't go. Don't go to the abyss. Please stay in the human world. Don't become a monster. Don't lose yourself. Please don't be afraid. Staring at her cheek that was close at hand, Huaisha opened his mouth with difficulty, used the last of his strength, raised his hands, and gently hugged her. Luo Xian was stunned. She could feel the warmth fading away. She raised her eyes and stared blankly at Huaisha's broken face. However, she saw a final smile on that dirty face with much difficulty. I'm here to save you, Your Highness. In the shadow under his feet, the ghost that had been waiting for a long time rose up, used the last bit of origin form, clenched the sword of virtue in his hand, and stabbed forward. It pierced through Huaisha's back and into Luo Xian's chest. A gentle glow lit up from the blade. It flashed and disappeared without a trace. Is this all you can do? Luo Xian looked at the broken face in confusion, full of confusion. Would this kind of trick be useful? It couldn't be said to be novel or even strange. At best, it was just a trick to perish together. But Huaisha's remaining strength was not even enough to pierce her heart. A futile last struggle. It was meaningless. At that moment, the darkness exploded. Luo Xian froze in place, looked down in disbelief, and saw the blood flowing out of the wound on her chest. Intense pain. But this unprecedented pain was different from the past. It was clearer, more real, and more unbearable. Even though the wound was only a shallow line, under this almost dust-like wound, the demon dragon's tragic wail rang out in her broken soul. The divine mark shook violently, but then it fell apart along with the darkness. Because something had arrived. It had descended on her body. Behind her, the crack that led to the abyss shook violently, and countless blurry figures screamed angrily, desperately flying over, wanting to break through the last barrier. But as the darkness trembled, it became more and more erratic, and then quickly dissipated. She froze in place. She felt an unbearable pain explode in her heart, and for some reason, she couldn't help but feel afraid. It was as if, in the hollow of her soul, something had sprouted, and then bore fruit. The fruit fell from the branch, returning to the dry soil. It brought a fleeting sweetness and an unprecedented sense of loss and satisfaction. It was too contradictory, too strange, and too frightening. He clearly wanted to get it again, but he wanted to pay more than he could get it. He clearly wanted to possess it again, but he wanted to give more than he could take it. After a drop of water fell, it set off a huge wave, swallowing everything that had once been. In the long emptiness, the first thing she felt was loss and confusion. And then, in the spread of gentleness, she felt the so-called gentleness, pity, and sympathy. In the midst of despair, she felt the happiness of a mirage. Finally, in the midst of sadness and bitterness, she felt the joy and happiness that made her afraid. It was unbelievable and completely incomprehensible. What is this? When she came back to her senses, she was already sitting in the dust, and she couldn't bear this cruel torture anymore. She choked, couldn't help but cry, and screamed, "What is this?" Silly child. Huaishe raised his hand, wiped the dust on her face, and told her gently, "Of course, it is love. In this cruel world, other than love, was there anything else that could beat killing and death?" In front of his chest, where his heart was pierced and torn by the blade, there was a last weak glow, so gentle, so quiet. This is what you yearned for, Luo Xian. The last origin substance that was transformed by the hand of imprisonment. The glow that was born from the pain and despair that was tempered by the pain and despair. Pure love. Giving without asking for anything, offering without hurting anyone, saving without asking for anything in return, and saving without waiting for gratitude. Luo Xian raised her head sluggishly, her lips trembling. For the first time, she felt the warmth of the hand on her cheek, as well as the joy and relief in the youth's smile. Too despicable. Huaishe, you actually dare to sneak attack me. She raised her head, resisting the urge to cry, and gasped for breath. Can't you act like a prince for once? I'm sorry, princess. Huaishe laughed regretfully. Times have changed. Now this shameless and vulgar prince persona is more popular. It's because of this that you can't find a girlfriend. Luo Xian choked, but she could no longer restrain the sadness and joy in her heart. She hugged the youth in front of her tightly and cried out miserably, just like a child. She finally found her way home. Tears slid down her cheeks, washing away the dust, and fell into Huaishe's palm. It was like dew falling into the desert. In a trance, Huaishe seemed to see the darkness behind Luo Xian constantly collapsing, and in the deepest part of the darkness, there was a dignified silhouette that was gradually dissipating. The moment before she left, she cast an indifferent glance at Huaishe. It was unknown whether it was praise or anger. Immediately after, she disappeared into the collapsing crack, never to be seen again. It seems I won. Huaishe forced a smile, closed his eyes, and fell on his back. In the unbearable drowsiness and dizziness, he finally welcomed the embrace of death. This was the result of this battle. The prince saved the princess. Love triumphed over everything. Chapter 289. Even if it's a fairy tale, love is too ridiculous, isn't it? Outside the sky of Yamatai, in the sea of the abyss, the shadow of a huge bird made a flying boat. On the back of the shadow, a 3-meter-tall giant man sat cross-legged beside a pile of empty cans. He opened a can of beer, raised his head, and gulped it down. He wiped his mouth and said, "It feels like a cartoon." In silence, Xian Niao slowly put down the index finger that he had raised for a long time. He watched the young man turn into a white light and fly out of Yamatai. He couldn't help but chuckle. "Isn't this good?" The old man asked happily. "It's good, but I really don't understand." Quafu scratched his head and was confused. "I've seen Xiaoxin's problem. Wasn't the Liberator's dust ineffective? If it's useful, I can borrow Cupid's arrow from Rome." Xian Yao looked at him for a long time with pity and sighed helplessly. "Finally, I know why you haven't married yet." Quafu was stunned for a long time, and countless question marks appeared on his head. What does this have to do with me not being married and not being able to find a girlfriend? Old man, don't look down on people. Xian Niao shook his head helplessly and sighed. That young man's soul power is indeed the transformation of source form and iron. He turned his love into iron and attached it to the blade of the sword. With the sword of self-sacrifice, he made up for Xiaoxin's lack as a human, so that she could reject the abyss and not be a monster. From this point of view, there were indeed some problems with our way of doing things. As he said, the old man raised his finger and looked solemn. But you ignored the most important point. What? Kwafu was confused. Love is a mutual thing. Xian Niao stared at him with disappointment. You can't accept someone who suddenly says he loves you, right? Kwafu wanted to say that he could, but he didn't want to be thrown out by the old man, so he could only shut up. Xian Niao knew what this silly guy was thinking. He didn't even want to be angry with him. This boorish guy who only knew how to chop and chop deserved to be alone all his life. He finally knew what happened to Kwafu at the annual Social Security Bureau fellowship party. Kwafu scratched his head and thought for a while. Then he suddenly understood. You mean Xiaoxian likes that guy? The old man couldn't help but roll his eyes. Whether he likes her or not is another matter. At least Xiaoxian is willing to turn from a monster into a human for him, which is a great improvement. That child has finally experienced the beauty of being born a human. He paused for a moment as he recalled the scene he had seen through the eye of Xing Jianji. He felt a headache coming on, but that kid is about to be wrapped up by the red thread. From the age of 18, rotten peach blossoms would continue all the way until they were 90 years old. Putting aside whether they were scum or not, no matter how one looked at it, they didn't seem like a good match. He would have to think about it later. And, as if it had eyes on the back of its head, Mystic Bird suddenly said, minors are not allowed to drink. Behind the empty jar, Zhu Qingyu pulled his hand away from the pile of beer as if he had been electrocuted and pretended to feed the pigeons. What are you afraid of? Kwafu asked carelessly. Minors can kill and set fires, but they can't smoke and drink? In my opinion, ascenders aren't afraid of alcohol, so there's nothing wrong with drinking less. Mystic Bird squinted at him. Sorry, I didn't say anything. Kwafu wisely averted his gaze, pretending that nothing had happened. Mystic Bird sighed. Dealing with this group of problematic children, he felt like he would one day have a brain hemorrhage. Thankfully, there were still children who didn't need to worry about them. Boom! A massive explosion sounded out from within Yamatai City. The three people on the illusory image glanced at each other, and an expression of understanding appeared on their faces. To be able to last this long against a level 5 cultivator at the 4th level, even with the white wolf hook in his hand, it's not easy, Kwafu said as he rubbed the stubble on his chin. This girl is getting more and more powerful. Mystic Bird understood this clearly. A badly damaged son, witch, and a child who died prematurely in the womb. Even if they were pieced together, they would only be a deformed, stitched monster. They are still far from being able to carry out heaven's might on behalf of a level 5 cultivator. But no matter what, that child Shuya has worked hard. He paused for a moment, then suddenly said, it should be about time, right? At the same time, at the border of the Yellow Springs, in the cold hall guarded by countless red spider lilies, a helpless sigh came from below the royal stairs. The left minister lowered his eyebrows, and a trace of worry appeared on his handsome face, making people feel pity for him. The situation had indeed become so bad that it could not be salvaged. The last effort had failed. Behind the curtain above the royal stairs, in the solemn darkness, a terrified voice came. It was as young as a child, and it was so flustered. What should we do? Since it has come to this, we can only ask Lord Gongfang to act, right? The left minister lowered his head and respectfully prostrated himself on the ground. Your Majesty, please endure the humiliation for the time being and wait for the right time. You mean, General? His Majesty behind the curtain was stunned, as if he was grabbing onto the last straw, but at the same time, he felt a wave of unease and fear. Ever since the balance between the Gongfang family and the Wu family was broken 90 years ago, who would not be afraid of this name? Even the emperor, who was high above in tradition, could no longer keep the tyrannical Gongfang in check. The funny thing was that the name Gongfang was used to refer to the ruler of Yingzhou, the emperor who was as noble as the sky. Now, when everyone mentioned this name, what appeared in their minds was the dark figure that brought fear to countless people. Gongfang of the Ghost. It meant that the ruler was like the ferocious giant ghost in the legend, fierce, tyrannical, powerful, and at the same time invincible. In Yingzhou, ghosts did not refer to invisible ghosts or the souls of the dead, but terrifying creatures that were beyond the reach of human beings, such as Jiotun, who was transformed by the tyrannical mountain god, and Ibaraki, who was transformed by the fallen dragon god. They were the nightmares formed by the ruler who was high above after he fell into the devil. Monsters that no mortal could resist, even if they used all their strength. Over the past 90 years, the general who had descended from the sky had crushed the rebels who had overestimated themselves time and time again with a terrifying smile. He had seized the authority of today by force, subverted the traditions, trampled on the ethics, and stepped on the bones of countless people to become one of the real dominators of Yingzhou. If it were not for the support of so many families and the inheritance of the Yingzhou genealogy, the current emperor would probably be a joke. A human-shaped seal, a ridiculous decoration. He could replace it at any time. At this moment, when he was suddenly mentioned, the voice behind the curtain became more and more panicked. Why? Why is it like this? The emperor asked. Didn't the minister of the left say that it was foolproof? The variables are unpredictable. The minister of the left knelt down and kowtowed. It was my mistake. Mistake? A hoarse voice came from outside the hall. The burly old man strode into the hall. His hair and beard were standing on end, and his big nose on his sallow face was burning red with anger. Just because of your miscalculation, you want His Majesty to bow his head to a martial artist who doesn't know etiquette? Don't you know that the emperor is humiliated by the emperor? Now that the imperial power is weak, if you show weakness so easily, can the minister of the left bear the consequences? As he spoke, the minister of the right remonstrated with a pair of huge eyes, looking at the figure on the steps. Your Majesty, you can't do this. Right, minister of the right? The emperor could not believe it. Why did you come back? If I didn't come back, your Majesty would have been deceived by that scoundrel and made a huge mistake. The minister of the right's breathing was chaotic, and the dust on his clothes had not been washed off. It was as if he had rushed back and did not even wash up before rushing into the hall. Your Majesty is the ruler of the country. You can't bow down to that martial artist over such a small matter. The child behind the curtain was stunned for a long time, still unable to make a decision. But the sun shamans, does your Majesty still not understand? The right minister suddenly roared, rudely interrupting the emperor's words. His angry voice was almost uncontrollable. The plan of planting sun shamans in Yamatai City is nothing more than a daydream to attract the favor of the emperor. We should not have placed our hopes on luck. If we don't cut off our wrists now, are we trying to break a rock with an egg and start a war with Dongxia? Isn't this following the wishes of that barbarian? If he has your Majesty's permission, how can he not do whatever he wants? We may have suffered great losses, but at the end of the day, it's just a border, the remains of a child who died prematurely, and a few sun shaman sage stones. Why can't your Majesty see this clearly? No, it's not just that. After a long silence, the emperor on the steps said in a low voice, I left my mother behind. The minister of the right was stunned, as if he had been struck by lightning. Your Majesty, don't tell me you. As if he had finally thought of the worst possibility, he stared at the figure behind the curtain in disbelief. His face turned pale, and he almost couldn't stand still. Don't tell me you even used the things left behind by the previous emperor? The emperor nodded his head timidly. In the dead silence, the minister of the right staggered back 2 steps, raised his trembling finger, and pointed at the minister of the left who had his back facing him. Then, he pointed at the emperor's figure and opened his mouth several times. His face turned red, and in the end, he collapsed on the ground without any strength left. Only a single tear flowed from the corner of his eye. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, his eyes were bloodshot and ferocious. He pulled out his sword and charged at the minister of the left. Traitor Wang, this old man will get rid of you today, you scourge. At that moment, he saw the minister of the left raise his head, and a mocking smile appeared on his face. After a quarter of an hour, the tightly shut doors of the palace opened again. The old man with a dull expression fell to the ground, unconscious. The palace servants who had been summoned hurriedly sent him out of the palace. Until he fainted, he still held the broken sword in his hand. There was a line of blood on the broken edge of the sword. It was like a tear. The minister of the right is already old and cannot understand your majesty's ambition to revitalize Tianjin. It is truly distressing to have such a lack of decorum in front of the emperor. The minister of the left knelt on the ground and begged bitterly, "Your Majesty, please be merciful and let the minister of the right return to his hometown and live out his life in peace." Is that so? The young figure on the royal stairs finally reacted from the terrifying struggle just now and nodded in panic. "Oh, it's okay, I cough. I can also understand the minister of the right's painstaking efforts. Then I will reward you heavily. Your Majesty is merciful." The minister of the left respectfully praised. "Your Majesty, please make a decision soon." After a long silence, the figure on the royal stairs suppressed the panic in his heart and finally made a decision. "Someone bring my imperial seal." Chapter 290. The sun, weary, gently bid farewell to the sea. Amidst the wails that shook the entire Yamatai city, a hoarse, singing voice could be heard. At this moment, you confess that your love is no longer there. Following Yishuiya's song, the white wolf silently ran, flashing through the air. From the shattered central area, a mournful waterfall soared into the sky. The falling sun let out its final tragic cry. Inside the scorched black pit, the blood-red sun was cut open. The mournful sunlight gushed out like blood, scattering in all directions. Bit by bit, it was so viscous. Under the layers of light, there were pieces of wriggling flesh. The dead child of premature death was still waving its dozens of tentacles. Its purplish-black flesh and blood took root and sprouted in the soil, spreading rapidly. Then he died quickly. In the end, under the gradually extinguishing sunlight, a sarcoma as large as a mountain was revealed. And in the flesh that was cut open from the middle, there was a giant eye formed from countless deformed compound eyes. The countless black compound eyes reflected the same face, and the countless lips of the same face opened and closed, humming the same song. In her hand, the white wolf hook was raised and stabbed forward. Noiselessly, it entered the center of his eyes. Blood flowed like a waterfall, completely dyeing Yishuiya red. Separated by the white wolf hook, the last trace of malevolence firmly stared at Yishuiya's appearance. He wanted to plant the most vicious curse. "Don't be sad." Yishuiya grinned and turned his head indifferently. He flicked the lighter and lit the cigarette at the corner of his mouth. If there was only the sun in the sky, how lonely would that be? Don't you think so? Her once pretty face was now covered in cracks. Purplish-black blood seeped out from her cracked facial features, making her look extremely ferocious. It was impossible to tell who was the evil spirit. Amidst the smile, the flesh and blood of the prematurely dead child suddenly convulsed crazily. Then, it completely stiffened and condensed into a pitch-black stone. Huge cracks spread out from the petrified eyes, and they fell apart. A tragic wail that resounded throughout the world spread in all directions, even reaching the depths of the abyss. The child that had died prematurely in the womb finally welcomed the complete annihilation. As for Yishuiya, he was already limp on the ground, having lost all his strength. She won, but he didn't feel happy. The broken sun shaman stigmata slowly rose from the wreckage, condensing into a solemn and broken glass sun disk in the air. It seemed to want to break through the air, but under the deterrence of the white wolf hook, it was frozen in place, unable to move. The child who died prematurely had died, and the sun shaman's sacred mark lost the soil that nurtured it. The purplish-black glazed sun continued to tremble, and countless tiny cracks appeared on it. Without a stable foundation, there was a possibility of it collapsing at any time. What was worse was that with the loss of its vitality, it was no longer able to maintain its sublimation state. Instead, it gradually lost its power and returned to its original solidified state. It was like a tree without roots. Even if it had sprouted new branches, it still couldn't stop itself from rotting and dying. 10 years of hard work from the Ingzhou Genealogy Institute was quickly fading away. It's been beaten back to its original state. How tragic. Yi Shuiya leaned against the ruins, tilting her head as she scrutinized its gradually dilapidated appearance. Not only did she feel pity or indifference, her tone didn't fluctuate at all. She just quietly smoked, humming an ancient song from the Russian Federation. The sun's face is tired, gently bidding farewell to the sea. It's at this moment that you finally confess, love is no longer here. The sun, the tired sun, had set. A crisp cracking sound came from her body. That was the sound of the sacred mark shattering. The Big Dipper dimmed. The power of forced advancement quickly faded, dragging her soul along with it as it fell apart. Therefore, she pinched the burnt cigarette between her fingers and smiled. Don't be afraid, I'm the same. The sun shaman's glazed light disk sensed danger. The cracked sun disk trembled, wailed, and wanted to escape. But under the gaze of the white wolf illusion, no matter how it flew, it couldn't break past 10 meters. The cold light of the silver hooks crisscrossed on the ground, drawing a circle on the ground. The white wolf illusion, with the Tao, it will swim. The talisman has changed. It is the spirit hook. From the collapse of the sacred mark, Yi Shuiya raised the white light in her hand. Her pale face was illuminated, contrasting with the blood oozing out of her mouth and nose. It became even more vivid. Just like that, she scrutinized this divine tool formed by the divine mark. She finally made up her mind and chanted the final ending. Wada is suitable, out of Een to see Zhou. In that instant, representing the reincarnation of the heavens, the divine mark that indicated the change of the country's fate pierced into Yi Shuiya's heart, pierced into the turbulent Big Dipper. In the next moment, the 9 obvious and 2 hidden stars fell apart. In the wailing and twitching of the soul, the Big Dipper, sacred mark, fiercely contracted, trembled, and finally, completely turned into chaos. Following the division of the white wolf hook, the sacred mark shattered. A cyan blue giant ape phantom flew out from Yi Shuiya's body, and the phantom of the moon fox of heart reappeared behind her. This was a completely unbelievable scene. Under the divine mark of the white wolf hook, Yi Shuiya's Big Dipper that was originally fused into one was unexpectedly cut back to its original state. The ginseng water ape that was fused into the soul was stripped out. Completely, without any residual or future troubles. Yi Shuiya was forcefully demoted. No, it would be better to say, it was like the system was reverting back to its original state, as if time was reversing itself, returning to the peak of the 3rd level. This was the true power of the white wolf hook. As the master of the Eastern Summer Genealogy, did the blackbird really need to make a move at any time? The answer was that it did not need to. As the symbol of the Eastern Summer Genealogy, the one who was in charge of the Eastern Summer Genealogy, when did it need to be like the twin flower red staff charging at the front and retreating at the back? As long as it stood there, it was enough to represent the Eastern Summer Genealogy itself. Its words could represent the views and opinions of all the Eastern Summer Genealogy's ascendants. As long as it raised its finger, there would be 100,000 Eastern Summer Genealogy's ascendants brandishing their weapons from Penglai Road to the southern Heavenly Gate pedestrian street. After cutting it down, they would cut it back again. If it was necessary, they could even repeat this 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Until it nodded and said that it was okay, they had washed themselves clean. As the blackbird's personal weapon, the white wolf hook was a divine mark extracted from history and miracles, standing side by side with the bloodshed scroll and the other 2 divine marks. Its true power was not to go out and fight to the death, but rather the authority and prestige of the blackbird as the master of the Eastern Summer Genealogy. In the hands of its true master, the blackbird, it did not even need to be unsheathed. As long as the old man glanced at it, it could instantly reduce an Eastern Summer Genealogy's ascendant from the 5th level to the blankboard. After the Blackbird inherited the position of the master of the Eastern Summer genealogy, it rarely used this supreme authority. It had not even been used on rebels. Those who dared to stab it were all casually crushed to death by the old man. Most of the time, it was used as a reloader, helping the juniors who failed to advance to return to their original state, accumulating experience and starting over again. Just like now, as his rank fell, countless blood spurted out from his pores in an instant. Yi Shui's entire body was dyed red. For a 4th-level ascendant, it could be considered a heavy injury, but for a 3rd-level ascendant, it was a death sentence. If it was not for the White Wolf's spirit protecting Yi Shui, she might have died on the spot. You see, I said before, we are all the same. She endured the twitching pain and raised her head. Her bloodshot eyes stared at the Sun Witch's stigmata in front of her, still smiling. Only, you need a little help. Amidst the sorrowful cry of the Sun Witch's stigmata, she staggered up and walked forward step by step. From a void behind her, the Heartmoon Fox's long tail stretched out, its hair standing on end. Its eyes lit up with the light of a predator, challenging the person above it. It was already so hungry that it could not be choosy. Until now, how could the audience not understand what this madwoman wanted to do? The entire Yamatai city was the stage that the Eastern Summer family had carefully built for Yi Shui. Here, to show the world the spirit of the strongest in the Eastern Summer's new generation. After experiencing an advancement, she wanted to abandon Big Dipper and once again challenge the 4th level. Advance towards the Eastern Azure Dragon, even if there were no more dragons in the world. Even if the Azure Dragon's divinity had disappeared without a trace, the path of ascension had been cut off, and there was no path forward. Since there was no path to take, then she would open up a path herself. Wasn't there an abundant amount of divinity in front of her that she could use? Even if its essence was damaged and it was no longer as glorious as it was in the past, the Sun Witch's stigmata had as much divinity as she wanted. Where did she get the confidence? In Rome, the blonde youth in the hall frowned. He didn't know whether he should laugh at the arrogance of his rival or admire her absurd courage. This kind of thing, other than the Blackbird, who would dare to say they have the confidence? The old priest said expressionlessly, "It's nothing more than a gamble. What you lack is this." The young man was stunned for a moment and frowned. She wants to prove that she is not inferior to the Blackbird of the past. The old priest lowered his eyes. She wants to be the strongest in Dongsha after 30 years. At this moment, whether it was Rome, the Russian Federation, India, or anywhere else, countless people turned on their televisions and watched this absurd advancement that was shown to the world. They witnessed the success or death of the number 1 person in Dongsha's new generation. As the White Wolf hook slashed down, the glass sun wheel shattered inch by inch. Just as the Sun Witch's stigmata wailed, endless light gushed out from it and engulfed Yi Shui's figure. The Moon Fox of Heart roared silently and took the initiative to jump into the blazing light. It was as if she was running towards death, embracing her new life. Don't be afraid. In the midst of the burning, Yi Shui stretched out his hand and gripped the last remnant of the sun, the broken blade. When you finish counting the cracks in the sky, we will be good friends forever, Light. Light swallowed everything. P.S. The title of the chapter is also a Soviet dance song that I like very much. I recommend it. P.S. 2. It seems that many friends didn't see it in the author's book, so I might as well write it here. I'm not in a good state these 2 days, plus I'm out of town. In 2 days, I'll be back to normal. Please don't worry. Today's Moon Breeze is also working hard on sponsor partnerships. Chapter 291. At this moment, between the endless sea and Yamatai City, a few people were nervously looking down at the changes in the light on the huge shadow of Xianbird. Kwafu was impatient. He drank a whole can of beer in one breath, scratched his head, and looked at Xianbird. Will it work? How would I know? Xianbird answered without raising his head. He frowned, as if he had seen some ominous signs. Kwafu was dumbfounded. Didn't you arrange this? The old man looked back at him, It should be said that she volunteered. Kwafu didn't know what to say. There must be some signs, right? You can't see anything? No, I can see it clearly with my eyes of the stars. There's absolutely no chance of survival. Xian Bird raised his hand, touched the few white whiskers on his chin, and sighed helplessly. This is her destiny. She can't avoid it. She can't escape. Maybe she can choose to take the initiative to face it. At least she can take the initiative in her own hands. Then it depends on her determination. If she can get through it, she will have a bright future. If she can't, she will turn into ashes. I can only give her a chance. Whether she can change her destiny or not, it depends on her. Is there no way? Kwafu asked. There is. Xian Bird raised his hand and pointed in the direction of the venue. Did you see the kid who just left? Yes, it's Huai Shi. That kid's luck is frightening. He is born to be a dragon among men. In the future, if he is not famous in history, he will be notorious for 10,000 years. If Shuiyu really wants someone to help her, as long as he is there, the possibility of success will increase by 10%. But the price is that she will be entangled with him in the future. The better way is to find Bai Zhe. With Bai Zhe, she can turn misfortune into fortune. As long as she doesn't go too far away from Bai Zhe, the death will never come. But you see, she didn't say anything in the end. Xian Bird said that this decision was not wrong. After all, it was better to rely on oneself than to rely on others. Luck was a thing. After all, there was a limit. Bai Zhe knew that her talent could easily make the younger generation useless, so she ran away all day. Of course, part of the reason was that she was lazy. Every day, she was thinking about how to travel with public funds. As for Huai Shi, if he's too close, he might be entangled by that kid's messy red thread. Thinking of this, he suddenly turned around and seriously instructed, Xiao Bai, you have to stay away from scumbags in the future, understand? The White Emperor's son looked up in confusion. Forget it. Pretend I didn't say anything. Xian Yao rubbed his brows tiredly. Anyway, with the destiny of the Phoenix, it won't be a big deal. Was he worrying too much? This was a problem that he had been trying to avoid. After becoming a mystic bird, he had the eye of the star and the ability to see through fate. Coupled with his cautious and stable style, it could be said that he had always been successful in everything he did. But at the same time, wasn't he being too cautious and rigid? After all, the elders couldn't walk all the paths for the children. Who was willing to listen to others' advice and be a puppet? Even if this path was a dead end in the eyes of Xian Yao, if she wanted to take a risk, could he tie her up every day? If she wanted to go, let her go. At least with him, she wouldn't be doomed eternally. At most, he would arrange for her to change her cultivation. There were 14 paths of ascension in the Dongxia genealogy, plus the 4 hidden paths. There was plenty of space for her to show her skills. But if it was possible, who would want their children to meet with failure? The rebellious period is too troublesome. Xian Yao sighed helplessly. He looked at the girl who should be about to reach the rebellious period and became more and more worried. Someone is coming. In the silence, the White Emperor's son suddenly raised his head and looked into the distance. In the sky, at the end of the endless sea, in the dark thunder and lightning, a humid monsoon blew. A rainstorm was coming. 20 minutes ago, Ingzhou Yukyu, under the brilliant afternoon sun, the sea rolled up to the golden beach. Outside the bar, the laughter of girls faintly came from the beach in the distance. People came and went, and it was lively. However, the shabby-looking bar was completely silent. It was so quiet that even the dust dancing in the afternoon sun seemed to have a sound. It's really a good sun, isn't it, customer? In the creaking sound of the wooden floor, the burly boss wearing a beach hat came back with a fishing rod. He threw the fish basket aside and looked up at the shadow in the corner. In the shadow, the minister of the left stood respectfully and waited with his head down. What would you like to drink? The boss glanced at him and rolled up the colorful sleeves of his shirt, revealing his hairy arms. He hung the hat on the hanger and walked to the bar. The minister of the left thought for a moment and said, "Plain water is fine. We don't sell that kind of thing here." The boss sneered and opened the whiskey bottle with his teeth. He broke a whole piece of ice from the fridge and threw it into a head-sized glass. Then he filled the glass to the brim. Bang! He slammed the glass in front of the minister of the left. Please. America's special whiskey for men, especially for sissies in Ingzhou. The minister of the left's face twitched. He looked down at the whiskey, which was obviously over the alcohol content, and didn't know if he should drink it. After hesitating for a long time, he sighed and said, I'm here with His Majesty's decree. That's none of my business. After the boss poured a cup for himself, he raised his head and gulped down half of it. Then he sat in front of the piano, casually lifted the cover of the piano, and casually played the keys on it. It was as if he was entertaining himself. The minister of the left's face was bitter. He picked up the glass and drank the whole bottle. Then he felt in his pocket, found an unfinished cigar, and lit it again. The smoke curled up and blurred his face. You can say whatever you want to say. It seems that I came at the wrong time. The minister of the left sighed. I didn't say that people from Ingzhou couldn't enter, but you guys always come too early or too late. The former is unpleasant, and the latter is even more unpleasant. I think it's better if you guys don't come, but this is your country. The boss shrugged. I'm just a passerby. The minister of the left stood up and held the emperor's decree in his hand. He bowed deeply and said, Please help us, General. The old man who was called General sneered. You should have said so earlier. Hey, Ingzhou people like to be so awkward. The minister of the left still maintained his begging posture. Now we can only rely on you to save the situation. Ah, that's true, but the man thought for a while and shook his head. No. The minister of the left was stunned. Let me guess. You must think that I'm a war maniac, right? The general smoked and said mockingly, Once there's a chance, I'll start a war everywhere like a mad dog. Anyone, anywhere, I'll see you, and I'll fight you to the death. Before the minister of the left answered, he nodded and admitted it. Yes, that's right. But now is not the time, kid. He laughed strangely. Before it's time for war, you have to learn to be patient, wait, and compromise. This is the common problem of you Ingzhou people. You're always fighting with other people because of bottles and cans. Why don't you cherish your own life? Following his hoarse words, an iron-like majesty appeared in his azure blue eyes. A terrifying power that was at the peak of the 5th level rose from this old man's body. It shrouded everything and oppressed everything violently. That voice paused after every word, like a hammer hammering the soul of the left minister. It wanted to turn his words into nails and wedge them into his brain. Since life is precious, it should be given an equal value. But here it's too cheap. If you don't cherish your own life, then others won't cherish you. If you don't cherish other people's lives, then others will treat you like ants. Isn't this the most obvious principle in the world? The minister of the left minister's face was pale. In front of this man, he no longer had his elegant demeanor. He could only muster up his courage. At least, please take back Yamatai City. His Majesty can, based on what? The general retorted. Just for a few philosopher's stones? Or for that shard of a broken mirror? That's too cheap. Kid, did you really take my words to heart? That voice was low and deep, like thunder exploding in the minister's ears. It cruelly tore his eardrums apart, causing him to fall to the ground in a sorry state. Viscous blood flowed out from his ears. He wanted to open his mouth and beg, but under the general's gaze, he could not make a sound, until a young voice came from outside the door. God's wedge. The emperor's voice came from outside the door. A short figure pushed open the door and walked in. The sunlight behind him hid his face in the shadows. Other than the sun shaman's stigmata shard, there's a God's wedge under Yamatai City. It's a legacy left behind by the previous law overlord. Is this not enough to repay the general? When his words rang out, even the general fell silent. It was not just the emperor's sudden arrival, but also the words that came from his mouth. God's wedge, the last miracle left behind by the gods in this world. It was also proof of their existence. No, it should be said that it was the only authority left behind by the gods before they died. A miracle of miracles, a power of power. It was a great object that surpassed the miraculous stigmata. If one wanted to break through the limit of the 5th level and step into the realm of the gods, It was something that was indispensable. Ingzhou still has such a heritage? After a long silence, the general suddenly laughed softly. As a reward, it's enough. But the problem is, why should I listen to the orders of a brat and let him ride on my neck? He slowly got up and lowered his head, staring at the short emperor in front of him with a mocking expression. You can't be thinking that you can order me around just by giving me some benefits, right? But the emperor raised his head and looked at him, staring at the face that was too terrifying for him. He suppressed the fear in his heart, even if his legs were already trembling. Could it be? He asked. Could it be that the general is not my subject? In the silence, the general froze in place, staring at the face that was gently twitching because of fear. After a long time, his shoulders suddenly shook. He laughed loudly. It was not only with anger or killing intent, but also with surprise or mockery. The hoarse voice turned into thunder, spreading above the vault of the sky, lifting the dark clouds and instantly covering the scorching sun and sunlight. The world instantly turned dark. Lightning burst out like burning metal, stinging everyone's eyes. In the end, only the loud sound of thunder echoed between the sky and the earth. Finally, you look like an emperor, brat. He grinned, looked at the child in front of him, and nodded with satisfaction. Very good. Since I'm here and become your subject, how can I not respect your orders? But can you bear the price of ordering me? The emperor trembled and did not speak. He stubbornly held his head high. Very good, very good. The general raised his wine cup and drank the remaining liquor in one gulp. Then I'll be back soon. The wine cup was placed on the bar counter, and in the wine cup, the ice cubes moved with the ripples of the water. Suddenly, there was a crisp sound, and it shattered, crumbling into powder like sand. Only the ferocious eagle statue broke out of the ice, and in the dim light, it spread its wings and flew high. It was so ferocious, and the figure in front of the emperor had already disappeared without a trace. What replaced it was a terrifying storm on the endless sea. Under the shadow that spread its wings and soared high in the sky, countless terrifying bolts of lightning and thunderclaps shot out, easily raising a tsunami that was tens of thousands of meters tall and brutally devouring all the borders and hells along the way. It went straight down, and in an instant, it came to the sky above Yamatai City. Then, an endless torrential rain rose from the sea and was gathered by the fierce wind, forming a terrifying tornado that was enough to swallow Yamatai City. Frenzied lightning shot out in all directions, because the figure that suddenly appeared along with the maniacal laughter punched forward. Thus, it was earth-shattering. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.